Before this video begins, I'd just like to give an extra special thank you to my patron, the Beast Boss. Links to join the Patreon can be found in the description down below. Okay, so the episode opens with a quick fourth wall break-in recap scene with the Doctor and Donna basically explaining what happened at the end of Series 4 and the 2009 specials, which I feel like this scene feels a lot like it was requested by Disney just to kind of catch everybody up, and maybe it wasn't initially in there. I do agree that we needed some sort of recap for some people, especially for people who are just watching it for the first time or haven't watched since Series 4 and can't remember exactly what happened. But I do feel like a more conventional, previously on trailer would have worked a lot better, because this does feel quite weird, especially with the Doctor just floating in space. I do think initially the idea would have probably been to have the Doctor inside the TARDIS or something, because that would have made a lot more sense. But I think they probably just chose not to do that because they didn't want to ruin the TARDIS reveal scene at the end of the episode, so instead they just kind of chose to put him floating in space, which is an interesting choice for the first impression we get of the episode, because it's literally like the first shot basically. Maybe they could have used the green screen to maybe just put in like Jodie's TARDIS or something like that. Obviously it was demolished, but like I say, he's on a green screen anyway, they probably could have put that in the background. So after that recap happens, we're then greeted to the brand new title sequence, which for the most part I quite like the new title sequence. I think the time vortex and TARDIS visuals look really good. I like how they have different cuts and it cuts to different shots of the TARDIS going through the vortex. It feels quite new and different, adds a lot of pace and energy to it, and I like the way the actors' names are revealed in this title sequence as well. However, I do have some problems with this title sequence. Number one being the music is out of sync, which is something that annoyed me way back in Capaldi's era as well, and it does make the title sequence feel way too quick as well, which some people kind of speculated this could be because it's kind of like a cut down version of Ncuti's title sequence for season 1, which I really do hope that is the case, because if this is going to be like basically the exact title sequence we also get for Ncuti's era, it's going to be a little bit annoying. But the main problem I have with this title sequence that I hope is fixed with Ncuti's title sequence as well is the kind of keyframed logo PNG for when the logo shows up at the end of the title sequence, because it just looks really bad. It's clearly just like I said, a PNG of the logo that they've just kind of added some keyframes to, or like a spin transition to, with like no motion blur or anything. And what makes this really annoying for me is we know they have like the assets and the 3D model from the logo reveal video that I feel like they could have just kind of somehow placed in here or adjusted slightly to fit with this title sequence. They do try to add a little bit of flair, making the outline of the Who kind of pop at the end, but it just would have looked a lot better if it was a 3D model like we saw in the logo reveal video, because it's kind of annoying that the logo reveal video makes the logo look better than the actual title sequence itself. So like I said, I hope that's something they change for Ncuti's titles, and that this is just because it's a cut down version of Ncuti's titles. So the first scene we properly get played out pretty much as a lot of us expected from what we saw with filming and some shots in the trailers and stuff. Feels very fast paced. I think there might have been some things cut from this, because I do remember we saw the Doctor using his heads up display and stuff like that on his sonic screwdriver during this scene in the filming. So I feel like some things might have been cut from this, and it does show because it feels very fast paced, but I also kind of don't mind how quickly we get into the action of the episode, because we basically meet Donna and Rose, and we also have the ship crashing within just a couple of minutes of the episode starting. Obviously, Donna misses the whole ship crash, which is very in character for Donna. We then also meet Sean once again, who the Doctor gets into a taxi with to go and find the crashed ship, with a nice little joke with the psychic paper referencing Jodie, and a really funny scene with the Doctor and Sean inside the taxi, which is kind of our first chance to really breathe in the episode, which is really nice. We obviously didn't spend too much time with him in the End of Time, because he was more just like showing that this is who Donna's going to marry at the end of the episode. I feel like he might have had some lines in the End of Time, but I can't really remember. So it's nice that we get to see a lot more of him in this, and I think he's great here. He really comes across as a character that's just kind of there along for the ride, not bothered about anything that's going on around him, which makes sense because he's with Donna, who gave away their lottery money. And speaking of the lottery money, I might as well talk about the lottery ticket as well, because I wasn't sure if this was something that was going to get brought up in the episode. If it was, I thought it would just kind of be a passing joke, but it does kind of become quite essential to the plot, as it kind of hints at Donna's memory of the Doctor and the fact that she's still got the meta-crisis in her somewhere, influencing her decisions, and shows that her character arc and character development from Series 4 hasn't been completely reset. In this episode, we also get to meet Rose Noble, Donna's daughter. There is a scene early on with Rose Noble, who is obviously trans, where she's getting called her dead name by some boys on bikes, which I personally think this was really good, as it shows trans people's lived experiences. But obviously, I'm not trans, and I've seen some trans people positive about this and some negative about this. But like I said, for me personally, I think it's good to show because it is a thing that happens to trans people. But if some people have problems with it, that's absolutely fine, and I'm obviously not the person to make that judgment. With that being said though, I do think the moment between Sylvia and Donna is really good and even better than that moment, because it shows although they make mistakes and find it difficult to remember sometimes, they still clearly love and respect Rose a lot, which is really nice. And speaking of that, Sylvia is really good in this episode. It's nice to see that she's become a lot more kind and supportive after the end of time and Journey's End, trying to distract Donna from discussions about the ship crashing because she doesn't want her to remember the Doctor in case she dies, which continues throughout the episode, pretending that she doesn't know the Doctor and she doesn't name him in case that'll make Donna remember. We then get a moment where the Doctor tries to sneak into the steelworks where the ship has landed, and he uses his sonic to draw this kind of holographic heads-up display, which I speculated would be a thing, which is a new feature of the sonic that I kind of don't mind. I think it's a pretty good feature of the sonic, and it kind of just shows the increased budget of these specials and hopefully the future seasons in this era, but I'll talk more about the sonic later on. The Doctor then meets Shirley-Ann Bingham, who I think was great in this episode, and I can't wait to see her in the future. I'm pretty sure she's going to be showing up in the later specials and hopefully in Shooty seasons as well. She has a really great moment where the unit soldiers have to go up some stairs to get to the ship, where she says, "Don't make me the problem, just get in there," which is not only good commentary on her disability, but it also works for the plot as well, as it means that she doesn't get hypnotized. Following this, we get the moment where Rose finds the Meep, who's played incredibly by Miriam Margolyes, and the Meep looks great in this episode. Until I saw Doctor Who Unleashed, I thought there was a lot more CGI involved in this, but it's a lot of practical stuff for the Meep, with just a little bit of CGI on top. And once again, you can really see the budget has increased for this new era. We also have a scene where Rose corrects the Doctor on the Meep's pronouns, and the Doctor asks the Meep of the pronouns, which I think was quite well done. I think it's not as clunky as some other lines in this episode, which I will get onto later on. We're then obviously introduced to the Wrath, who are trying to capture the Meep. The first time we heard them speak, I was a little bit unsure at their voices at first, as they just kind of sounded like normal guys with not really any voice effects or anything on top of it, but I did prefer the way they spoke when we hear them in the court scene later on. Whilst they're in Donna's house looking after the Meep, we get a little scene with a reference to Wilf, which for a second I was worried that they might have cut him out of the specials because he couldn't finish filming, but luckily it was just a fake out joke. Obviously this is then followed by a huge action scene between Unit, the Wrath and Meep, where the Doctor draws some shields with his sonic, which I don't really like as much as the heads up display, but at least it takes him some time to draw them so it isn't too overpowered, and once again it just kind of shows the big budget of this special. And before that we also get my favourite moment in the whole episode.
Something smells nice.
Tuna madras.
So our main characters escape this epic sequence in Sean's taxi, which although being shot at by the Wrath is completely fine, which at first I thought was a bit weird and convenient, but luckily this was intentional, because this, along with the unit soldiers only being stunned and not killed, was on purpose, as the Wrath weren't trying to kill anybody, just trying to retrieve the Meep as their prisoner without any casualties. So that was a nice little explanation as to what seemed like a bit of a plot hole or plot convenience. So the final act of this special is the Meep trying to escape in their ship, which would destroy London because of the way it intakes fuel, and obviously the Doctor goes onto the ship to stop the Meep, which we then get the moment where Donna leaves her family to go and help him, calling him the Doctor, which Sylvia notices and is significant as nobody has called him the Doctor all episode, as Sylvia was worried about bringing Donna's memories back and her dying. So it's a nice way of showing that Donna is starting to remember who the Doctor is, or just that in her subconscious she knows she needs to help him. So she obviously joins the Doctor on the ship, but they're then separated and the Doctor can't access all the controls that he needs to stop the Meep, and he also doesn't have enough time to tell Donna what to do on the other side, which I think was a really great excuse to have Donna's memories be brought back by the Doctor and to have the Doctor Donna back. So the Doctor brings Donna's memories back with this kind of Winter Soldier-esque code word type thing, which I thought was a nice little touch, and we find out that Donna only has 55 seconds to live, which doesn't have as big of an impact as it could have because we know she's going to be in future episodes of the specials because of the trailers, but at least they don't try and make it too big of an emotional moment when she dies, because I guess they knew that we knew this wasn't the end for her. And we get an explanation as to the reason that she doesn't die, and it's because the meta crisis that was in Donna has been shared between Donna and her daughter Rose, which I think was a really clever way of resolving that issue and explaining why she hasn't been killed by remembering who the Doctor is. However, I do personally think relating it to Rose's gender does make it a lot more complex than it needs to be, and the non-binary line relating to binary feels a little bit clunky to me, and it also doesn't really make too much sense because Rose is portrayed as being a trans woman, not non-binary in this episode, so I do feel like it was just making it a little bit too complex for what it needed to be, and I would have been perfectly happy for it to just be because Rose is Donna's daughter, so the meta crisis was inherited and split between the two of them. The other problem I have at this point in the story is Russell's reliance on what I like to call the big friendly reset button. Obviously, it makes sense that whatever they do in the ship kind of stops what the Meep is trying to do and stops the ship from taking off, but I'm not a big fan of the cracks in the ground kind of closing up and fixing themselves. I think it would have been cool to just kind of leave the cracks there, but I guess maybe that could become a problem for episodes in the future because they'd have to explain that later on down the line. And finally, another problem I had with this moment is the way the meta crisis thing is resolved, because obviously, although it was shared between Donna and Rose, they still had that meta crisis in both of them, and that's something that they kind of couldn't have continue in for the next couple of episodes, or they didn't want to continue for the next couple of episodes. But I feel like the explanation of them just letting it go felt very unsatisfying, and the explanation feels very clunky and forced, and it kind of just makes you think why Donna hasn't done this already, and the explanation as to why the Doctor hasn't thought about this before just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And yeah, like I said, letting go of the meta crisis just doesn't feel like a satisfying end to that whole arc from series 4, and just feels like a bit of a cop-out to me. However, like I said, it does mean it's something that we don't have to worry about for the next couple of episodes, and maybe Russell just didn't want that part running throughout all the specials and needed to get it wrapped up here, because it also means we don't basically have two Doctors running around for all the specials. But like I said, I feel like it was just done way too quick and not in a very satisfying way. So just before the Meep is being taken away by the Roth Warriors, they make a reference to somebody called the Boss, which sounds very vague and generic of a hint or threat, and does kind of come across as a little bit of weak writing. However, I do think it works a little bit better because of the Doctor's cryptic "I hate that" line that comes afterwards. We're then finally introduced to the brand new TARDIS interior, which I think looks great. I love the moment it's revealed as well, especially with David Tennant as the 14th Doctor running around it and doing basically a lap around the TARDIS, giddy with excitement, just like a child would be. As for the interior itself, I really love it. I think it's one of the best TARDIS interiors I've ever seen, possibly the best, but there's definitely a few things, like a few other people have said, that could improve it, like some bits of furniture and decoration here and there, which I assume we're probably going to get when Ncuti takes over the TARDIS. I'd hope so anyway, but even without that, I love it. It looks really big and expansive, and I love the fact that the lights can change to any colour and do all these different movements and stuff like that. And obviously the episode ends with a cliffhanger with Donna spilling coffee on the TARDIS, which is very in character. Overall, I think this episode was pretty good. I had a really fun time with it, and it was very fast paced and felt very large scale and big budget, which makes sense given all the Disney money. But obviously, like I said, I do have a few problems with it, specifically towards the final act and some of the explanations around the meta crisis stuff, but that doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy this episode. Okay, so a lot of people were very excited for this special and had a lot of high expectations for this episode, expecting a lot of surprise cameos and a lot more, mainly down to its secrecy in terms of the marketing, which may have been not the best decision from the team, which Russell has acknowledged himself.
I think that might have had an unfortunate effect. I think everyone's expecting Matt Smith and Peter Capaldi and the ghost of William Hartnell riding on the back of the Garm.
But personally, for me, for this episode, I just wanted something kind of weird and mind-bending and scary, with some good character work and emotion in there. Something a little bit like Series 4's Midnight, and luckily, that's exactly what we got for this episode. So this episode starts with a cold open with Isaac Newton under the apple tree, and I seem to be the only one who liked this cold open from what I've seen at least. I know a lot of people have complained about how pointless and unnecessary it feels, which is true, but for me personally, I honestly don't really see why that matters. It doesn't necessarily have to have much of a point to it, and it's just a bit of a fun scene that's setting up a running joke with the episode, and a nice way to kind of make you feel kind of comfortable before the episode gets really scary and weird, which I think just really adds to the impact of the scary and weird stuff in this episode.
You can appreciate
the gravity of the situation.
So I love the opening of this episode proper, with the Doctor and Donna exploring the ship, and also the fact that the TARDIS leaves with the Sonic I thought was a really good touch, because it means they not only don't have the TARDIS to escape, but the Doctor also doesn't have his Sonic, which we now know is significantly upgraded from the past. I think the ship looks really great for the most part, especially the small practical rooms, the actual sets that were used in this episode, and the huge expansive CGI corridor was really cool. I've seen a few people say that this part of the ship looks pretty bad, and while I don't completely disagree, I think for the most part it looks pretty good, but there are some parts where the CGI and like the green screen of that corridor setting, such as when they're running and stuff like that, does look a little bit bad, and the keying of the green screen is a little bit too obvious, which is a shame, but like I said, for the most part I actually thought it looked pretty good. And yeah, this whole opening bit with the Doctor and Donna is very reminiscent of something like The Ark in Space from classic Doctor Who, which is one I've actually seen, where they're just trying to figure out where everyone is and what's going on, and there's a few mysteries introduced for the episode as well, with the different words being said over the tannoy and the clanging they hear every now and then, as well as them finding out that the airlock opened and closed 3 years ago, and also the fact that Jimbo, the cute little robot, is walking one step at a time every now and then when we hear the words. So then we're introduced to the main villains of the story, which people are dubbing the Not Things, and I think the introduction of these villains was really well done. For a second, I thought we were just kind of having a little jump cut that was kind of skipping us ahead in time whilst they were finishing off this task that they were doing in separate rooms, until we then cut back and see that there's actually 2 versions of the Doctor and Donna in each of the rooms, and none of our characters know about it, and I think it was just really, really well done for that introduction, especially when we didn't know what the villain or the threat of this episode was going to be, which is one of the benefits of it being so secretive. And you can say what you want about what the creatures look like and some of the effects of the creatures, which I'll get to later on, but the initial line before all that happens of "my arms are too long,"
My arm's too long.
was just so creepy, and such a creepy line to have in the show, and worked very effectively, especially the delivery of this line from both of the characters, with just how calmly and nonchalantly they say it, and the fact that they have to repeat it multiple times before our characters even click what is going on. And the concept of these creatures is a really great idea, very reminiscent of The Thing, and also quite reminiscent of that story Midnight, which I was talking about earlier on, which is what I wanted this episode to be like. And this concept also allows for some great character work and acting from Tennant and Tate in this episode. So I think the practical effects of the Not Things, such as the big long arms and the double knee and stuff like that, I think looks great. And the CGI in some points actually looks really good as well, but there were a few points with the CGI, such as the Snapchat filter or Miss Evangelista type face effects, as well as the Not Thing Doctor sticking his head out from underneath his legs, that I personally thought didn't look the best. And like I said earlier as well, some of the moments where they're running down the corridor, the CGI looks pretty bad as well, or is at least a bit noticeable where it shouldn't be. There's a few moments in here as well where the Doctor and Donna obviously inevitably get separated and don't know whether they're talking to their Not Thing self or the real self. And one of these situations we get a little reference to the Timeless Children and the Flux. We finally have acknowledgement that the Flux has destroyed half the universe and that it hasn't been fixed or reset, which is something that Chibnall didn't even bother to do in his own era, which was something that really annoyed me about the Flux. And we also get to see more emotion from the Doctor and more of a reaction from the Doctor about the Timeless Children stuff than we also got in Chibnall's era, which isn't like Jodie's fault or anything. It's more Chibnall not writing a scene like this for Jodie in that era, which I think was a really missed opportunity, so I'm glad that we got that in this. So then we find out that the Not Things basically learn things from the characters the faster they do stuff, and that's the reason they're trying to scare them, to get their adrenaline pumping and to get them thinking so that they can copy them even faster and even better, which leads to this great moment where the Doctor, wanting to solve all these mysteries, is told that he needs to stop thinking so that the Not Things can't evolve and become more like them. But obviously he just really wants to think and try and solve all these mysteries that have been set up earlier on in the episode, which he eventually ends up doing. And so that reveals these few mysteries that we had at the start of the episode, with the clanging being the captain floating in space,
Rehab was supposed to be a fresh start.
which also explains the airlock being opened and closed 3 years ago. We find out the words are actually a countdown, they're actually the numbers of the language that these aliens spoke, which I think was really well done because the Doctor initially shrugs off the possibility of a countdown early on. And we also find out the reason that Jimbo, the robot, was walking so slowly was because it was slowly walking towards this self-destruct button that the captain had set up and made to go slowly so that the Not Things couldn't figure out what was going on. And the conclusion to this story, initially I was a little bit confused, and it did feel a little bit like a Deus Ex Machina of sorts, but it does actually kind of make sense when you think about it and kind of realize what it means and what's actually going on, because the TARDIS would obviously know if the Not Things aren't going to be able to reach Jimbo in time to stop the countdown, which is what is about to happen. The TARDIS would obviously realize that and be able to show up early enough to pick up the Doctor and Donna. But obviously then the Doctor picks up the wrong Donna in a great moment where he asks them the question that was set up earlier on about Mrs. Bean, asking them the question why that name is funny, and he ends up taking the Donna that says because it just is, because he obviously thinks that's more like what Donna would say, but this ends up actually being the wrong Donna, which I think is great because it kind of shows that although that would make sense and that is what I was thinking in my head, I was like, yeah, that would be the right Donna, it shows that maybe that would have been initially what the real Donna was thinking, but she probably thought that wasn't a good enough answer for the Doctor and probably overthought the question a little bit, which ultimately led to her not being taken by the Doctor and the Doctor not believing that she was the real one, which led to a great showcase of Catherine Tate's acting ability in this episode when she's shouting for the Doctor to come back because he's taken the wrong one. And then we get another fake out death with Catherine Tate, although this one works significantly better than the fake out death in the Star Beast, because they almost didn't play that one in the Star Beast seriously and give it enough weight to make it feel real. Maybe because they knew that we knew she was going to be in future episodes. But in here, they really play it as if it is actually about to happen. And even though we know she's going to be in the Giggle, for a second, I still genuinely thought she might die here and maybe be replaced by her Not-Thing counterpart or something like that. And I was genuinely on the edge of my seat from what I remember. Like, I was literally on the edge of my seat. But obviously, the Doctor then realizes in the TARDIS, I think by scanning the Not-Thing Donna, that she is in fact the Not-Thing Donna, not the real Donna, which I do feel like was a little bit unsatisfying, a way of him realizing that that wasn't the real Donna, because it isn't actually about him kind of figuring it out himself. He just kind of scans her on the TARDIS and realizes that one of her arms is too long or something like that. So I think that could have been done slightly better. But obviously, after doing this, the real Donna is then reunited with the Doctor in the TARDIS, and they go back home, but they're maybe a day or two late, according to the Doctor, which leads them to arriving exactly where they just left. But this time, Wilfred Mott is there to greet them. And for those who don't know, Wilf is probably my favourite character in all of Doctor Who, and so I was so happy to see him. I knew he was going to be in this. I just didn't know exactly when we were going to see him, but I'm so glad we finally did. Even if this is going to be his only appearance in the specials, which has been alluded to, the fact that this is the scene that they managed to film with him is just so great, because it was such a great scene and such a great moment between him and the Doctor and Donna, and the perfect scene for his reappearance in the show, because now we finally at least know that he knows Donna remembers these things now. He can talk to Donna about it, and he finally gets to see the Doctor in the same face that he remembers once again. Like I said, I think it was the perfect scene to have of him in this special, and I'm just so grateful that we actually got to have this scene and this moment in these specials. And it's just great to see Wilf and Bernard Cribbins again, obviously. And then this leads to a great cliffhanger to the next episode, The Giggle, where we just kind of see everyone going crazy, which, you know, doesn't give too much away and just perfectly sets everything up. Really feels like there's high stakes going into this next episode straight from the get-go, and I just can't wait to see where this leads us to. So, like I said at the start of this video, although we were expecting a little bit more from this episode, or at least some people were, all I personally wanted from this was something weird and mind-bending and scary, with some good character work and emotion, and like I said, something a little bit like Midnight from Series 4. And obviously, like I said, that's exactly what we got, and I loved it. The character work in this was great, whether that be between the Doctor and Donna, or them and their Not-Thing counterparts. I do think this episode works a lot better on the page. It's perfect on the page, and it works almost perfectly in the execution, because like I said, the practical effects look great, but obviously some of the CGI was a little bit ropey in there, but for me it still kind of works just because of how weird it was. So I thought the Toymaker was really good in this episode. I haven't seen the original story, and obviously a lot of it is missing, so I don't really know what he's meant to be like, but I do know that original story isn't meant to be that good anyway from what I've heard. But I did think the Toymaker was really good in this. Probably the only complaint I really have is I do feel like he should have dropped that German accent a little bit sooner than he did, or been speaking mostly in that British accent for most of the time, because it did start to get a little bit annoying after a bit, and I thought he was going to drop the accent when the Doctor immediately recognises him, or first recognises him in the toy shop, which he doesn't, but I do feel like that would have been a lot better if he had done that. I know the accent is meant to be purposefully bad, but it still gets a little bit annoying throughout the episode. I think the Toymaker's realm was really well visualized in this story. Obviously, it's not something they could have really done this well in the 60s, and so the visuals of that endless corridor and the black void that they're in, I think was visualized really well, and a nice updated version of the Toymaker's realm. And I also liked the companion puppet show that the Toymaker put on for the Doctor and Donna, to show Donna what had happened with the Doctor's companions since she left. I've seen a lot of people complaining about this, saying there's no mention of Chibnall era companions, but to me that's really obvious that it's because those characters didn't die like the characters the Toymaker is talking about. Obviously I know those characters didn't actually die, and that's what the Doctor is saying, but that's obviously the reason these companions were chosen. And there is still a mention to Flux in there, so it's not like Chibnall Erasure or something like that. And I obviously really liked the creepy puppet scenes, especially the one with the Doctor, with the puppet of the guy we see in the cold open, and the puppet of himself. But obviously also I really liked the creepy scene between Donna and Stooky Sue and the Stooky babies, which I think was really creepy as well. But personally I think the bits with the Doctor in that moment worked a lot better. And obviously, whilst we're still on the topic of the Toymaker, I really liked the Spice Up Your Life scene. It was really creepy, especially with David Tennant playing it straight as the Doctor when those unit soldiers die. It just really shows how crazy the Toymaker is, because he's just having so much fun with this when people are dying. In terms of the actual Giggle plot that is throughout this episode, the thing that this episode is named after, I think it was really well set up with the post-titles scene, and even the cold open with John Logie Baird, who I thought was was going to feature a little bit more in this episode than he did, but I'll get onto that later. But yeah, the Giggle plot was really well set up with the scene after the title sequence where we see the effect it's having on the general population of Earth, and it was also really well set up with the scenes at Unit in the first half, with some great commentary on society and the government, and obviously the anti-vax allegory with Trinity Wells, which I think was really well done. But the problem I have with the Giggle plot is that it seems to basically take a bit of a backseat once the Doctor and Donna travel back to 1925 and confront the Toymaker, and from that point on it just feels a little bit disconnected from the rest of the plot, and I think it's really unfortunate that we don't get to see the effect it has on humanity outside of that post-title scene that I talked about earlier. And I think for that reason this episode could have benefited a little bit from being either 2 parts, or what I personally think would have been better is if it was a 90-minute episode like The Power of the Doctor, because that would have just given us more time to see the effect it has on humanity outside of that one scene at the start of the episode. Obviously, Unit are in this episode, and they have the brand new Unit HQ, which looks a bit like Stark Tower or Avengers Tower, which I think looked really good. And they also have the Vlinx, which is a robot-type alien creature in there, which isn't really explained as to why he's there. But for me personally, what I think that is they're just trying to fill out the Unit roster for a potential spin-off in the future, similar to Mr. Smith in Sarah Jane Adventures. And speaking of Unit, it's great to see some of the returning characters. Obviously, we get to see Kate Stewart in this episode, who gets a really good moment when she takes the Z-Dex off, or deactivates her Z-Dex to show the effects of the Giggle, and it's just really nice to see her written by RTD, and I can't wait to see her return in the future with Ncuti Gatwa. This also leads to a nice moment with Shirley, which shuts down the complaints of the bigots that they had in the Star Beast, who basically just don't understand that disability is a spectrum, and were basically accusing Ruth Madeley of not being disabled, which is just insane. So I'm glad that that was in there. It's almost like Russell predicted that that was going to happen, those complaints were going to be made by bigots, and so that moment just works really well for that. And we also get a nice moment with Mel when she first sees the Doctor again, and the Doctor first recognises her after almost not noticing her immediately, which I think was a really good way of doing it. But unfortunately, although these characters have these nice moments at the start, they don't actually end up doing a whole lot in the episode, because they kind of get sidelined for the second half. Because like I alluded to earlier, once the Doctor and Donna go back to 1925 to confront the Toymaker, the whole Giggle plot kind of takes a back seat from the rest of the plot, and these characters' appearances kind of suffer with that as well, which I think is really unfortunate. But like I said, I enjoyed the moments we got with them in this episode, and I think they were really good. I just wish we would have been able to see more of them, and that as well could have been a benefit of having this episode be 90 minutes long or a 2-parter or something like that. Okay, so obviously this is the last episode of these specials with the 14th Doctor, at least as the main Doctor in the show. So he obviously regenerates in this episode. And for me personally, I quite liked this regeneration. I really liked how sudden the regeneration was. The Doctor was basically like mid-sentence when he gets shot by the galvanic beam by the Toymaker, which I think was really good and felt kind of shocking and sudden, especially with how much left of the episode we had. Obviously with 10's regeneration, back in the End of Time Part 2, it ended with him alone in the TARDIS saying, "I don't want to go," which is quite a controversial line, which at the time I liked, but the more I think about that line, the more I realise it's a little bit unfair on the next Doctor, which at the time was Matt Smith, so it isn't my favourite final line of a Doctor. But with 14's regeneration, who is obviously also David Tennant, he regenerates surrounded by friends like Donna and Mel, who are right by his side, which I think was really nice. And instead of saying "I don't want to go," he says "it's time" and "allons-y," which obviously means "let's go" in French. So I just really liked that contrast of the 14th Doctor and the 10th Doctor's final lines, which was something I was really hoping for in this episode. And as well as that, we also got some nice references to previous classic regenerations in this moment as well, with the Doctor saying "here we go again," which is a reference to the 3rd Doctor's regeneration, and him saying "it feels different this time" just before the bi-generation, which is a nice reference to the 5th Doctor's regeneration in Caves of Androzani. Now we're getting on to the bit that you're probably all here for, the bi-generation in this episode, a brand new addition to Doctor Who canon basically, in terms of Time Lord regeneration mechanics and stuff like that. Now I had seen the leak before this episode, unfortunately, although I had only read it once and I didn't read it again like really close to the episode or anything, so I didn't remember the exact details, but I had read the leak. And while I didn't like the idea on paper of the leak, I do feel like the execution of this concept and this bi-generation was a lot better than I expected it to be from reading the leak itself. It allows us to have a multi-Doctor story for the 60th anniversary specials in a way that we've not seen before, with a future Doctor meeting our current Doctor instead of a past Doctor, which I think was a really interesting thing to do. And seeing David Tennant and Ncuti Gatwa on screen together was really good, and I think they had really good chemistry. And I also seem to be the only person that liked the catch scene in this episode. I just thought it was a really fun conclusion to the episode and a really fun way to beat the Toymaker. And a lot of people seem to be complaining about this idea, being confused as to why the Toymaker isn't able to just catch a ball because of how powerful he is. But this is explained earlier on in the episode with the fact that the Toymaker doesn't cheat. That's the one thing he basically doesn't do. He plays by the rules.
The only rules the Toymaker follows are the rules of the game. They bind his entire existence.
But with that being said, I really don't like this line.
Do you come in a range of colours?
I also like the scene with the 14th Doctor having a meal with Donna and her family at the end of the episode. I think it was a really well executed and emotional scene, and David Tennant was just great in that moment. And overall, this bi-generation idea, this concept, was a nice and interesting way of concluding this era and passing the torch to not only Ncuti Gatwa, but just to a brand new era of the show in general. However, although I thought the bi-generation thing as a whole was really well executed, I still don't know how I feel about the concept in the first place. Obviously, this means that the 14th Doctor is still around, which I'm not sure how I feel about. It feels very similar to the end of Journey's End, with the Meta-Crisis Doctor going to live his life with Rose in the parallel universe, and it just really makes it seem like RTD really wants to just keep his favourite Doctor around as much as possible. And I really think the 14th Doctor shouldn't have kept his own TARDIS at the end of the episode, because that just invites him to return in the future and also makes him equal to the 15th Doctor, which just slightly undermines the 15th Doctor a little bit in my eyes. And I really hope and don't think that this is setting up a 14 and Donna spin-off, as it would just be too similar to the main show, and some people would just kind of be treating this as like, this is real Doctor Who, and Ncuti Gatwa isn't real Doctor Who, and I just don't think that would be fair. But I do think that maybe 14 and Donna will appear often in maybe like the unit spin-off that they seem to be setting up with the Vlinks. I just hope they don't get a spin-off of their own, because I don't think that would be fair. And to add on to that, I just think the optics of this, from a conceptual standpoint, just isn't great, because it just kind of gives ammunition for certain people to say that Ncuti Gatwa isn't the real Doctor, and the real Doctor is still out there somewhere in the 14th Doctor, which I just think is a little bit unfair on Ncuti Gatwa, and it's not great optics for the first black main Doctor. But talking about Ncuti Gatwa, I think he was really good in this episode. Right from the outset, I really enjoyed him, and they do try to give him as many of the Doctor's lines as possible once he's introduced in this episode, although he does still feel somewhat overshadowed by David Tennant being there, especially with this being the 14th Doctor's story, and they still need to conclude the 14th Doctor's story in this episode. But I can't wait to see him as the full-time Doctor at Christmas and next year in Season 1 or Series 14 or whatever we're calling it. And obviously, also at the end of the episode, we get a little hint to the Master returning, with the fingers picking up the golden tooth that the Master is supposedly trapped in, which I personally think this was just meant to be a bit of a jokey moment from RTD, a nice little reference back to Series 3 where this also happened, and I don't think there's any immediate plans to bring back the character anytime soon, or at least I hope not, because I think the Master needs a break for a little bit before they bring him back, and I really hope Anya and Barnard is not playing him in Season 1, because that seems like that concept will just be too similar to the whole Saxon arc in Series 3. So overall, I really enjoyed this episode for the most part. I'm still not 100% sure how I feel about the bi-generation, just as a concept to begin with in this episode. Although, like I said, I do feel like it was really well executed in this episode. And the more I think about this episode, the more I like it, which is basically the opposite of how I feel about the Star Beast. Basically, the Star Beast, for the most part, I liked as an episode, but the more I think about the ending of that episode, the more I dislike it. While Blue Yonder, I've been pretty solid on, like, I love that episode. There's a few dodgy VFX in there, but for the most part, I think it's really good. And this episode I really enjoyed, and the more I think about it, the more I like it. So that's kind of how I feel overall about the specials. For that reason, I think I'd put the Star Beast at probably a low B tier, possibly even C tier. I'd easily put Wild Blue Yonder at A ranking, and I think I'd put the Giggle at a high B on the tier list. For the first time since 2017, we got a Doctor Who Christmas special with The Church on Ruby Road. This episode sees the introduction of the brand new 15th Doctor, as well as companion Ruby Sunday. But was this episode good? Okay, so the first time I watched The Church on Ruby Road, I wasn't quite sure how I felt about it, possibly because I was watching it with family and couldn't give it my full attention. I didn't love it, nor did I hate it, but I was leaning more towards not liking it after the first viewing. But after rewatching it a couple days later, I liked it a lot more. Obviously, the main thing about this episode is Ncuti Gatwa as the 15th Doctor.
I'm the Doctor.
Who I really liked in the role straight away. He feels like the Doctor immediately and is really likeable, and I liked how much more emotionally open this Doctor is, especially in comparison to the 13th Doctor, who was quite emotionally closed off. However, I don't feel like Ncuti has had his Doctor moment yet. It comes close with the scene that was requested by Disney, where he's talking to that police officer.
If you don't mind, I just got snowman, and I would like to go home.
But I still don't feel like he's had his proper Doctor moment yet. But I'm sure he'll get that somewhere in Season 1, probably in the first episode. Speaking of the Disney requested scene, I'm not sure how I felt about this scene, because although I really liked it and I thought Ncuti Gatwa as the Doctor was great in it, I do feel like it would have had much more of an impact if we didn't see the Doctor properly until he first properly introduces himself to Ruby on the ladder, as was originally intended. But like I said, I did really like him in that scene, so I'm a little bit conflicted there. As for the other brand new main character we got in this episode, Ruby Sunday, I really liked her as as well. This is more of Ruby's episode than the Doctor's episode, which makes sense as it's meant to be similar to episodes like Rose, where we follow the story through the companion's point of view and are introduced to them before we're introduced to the Doctor. I also really like Ruby's family. I'm glad RTD is bringing back the domestic aspects of the show that he did so well in his first era, and having a companion's family that we can relate to and get to know over time. I think her relationship with Carla is great, and I love how close they are, especially when we see what Carla's life would be like without Ruby towards the end of the episode.
Why would I want a daughter when I'm happy as I am?
Then why are you crying?
And also, of course, Ruby's grandmother, Cherry. I think she was the best character in the whole episode. She was absolutely hilarious, and I can't wait to see her in future episodes. I've said this before in another video, but I seem to be the only person who actually likes the new sonic screwdriver design. It's a nice, refreshing design, and anyone who's complaining about it not looking like a screwdriver, as if the past few Sonics really looked anything like a screwdriver either, are coping really hard. The intelligent gloves, not psychic gloves, as Shooty said, were a cool addition to the episode. Their introduction in the story, both when they're on the ladder and when they escape the Goblin's ship, is a really clever and organic way to set up the conclusion to this story. Obviously, in this episode as well, we have the Goblins and the Goblin King, which I think were a very interesting and unique addition to the show, helped by the Toymaker paving the way for more supernatural villains like this. And for that reason, I liked how they worked differently to anything we've seen before. It allows for the Doctor to have some fun moments of excitement and joy as he figures out how their technology works. Obviously, we also have the Goblin song in this episode. I had heard the Goblin song before the episode aired, and honestly was dreading watching that moment with my family.
He's the Goblin King, yes, the Goblin King. He's not a myth, he's an actual thing.
And at the time of watching it on Christmas Day, I did feel quite embarrassed and didn't like it on first viewing. But I think this is mostly just because I was watching it with other people and feeling embarrassed. But after rewatching the episode, I think the Goblin song fits very well with the rest of the episode. And I even like when the Doctor and Ruby join in with the singing. However, I do think this moment would have worked a lot better if we didn't already know the song was going to be in the episode and didn't get to hear the song beforehand. The main problem I have with the Goblins and the Goblin King in this episode is they do take a bit of a backseat once the Doctor and Ruby escape the Goblin ship. We do now know from the commentary that there was meant to be a scene where the Doctor and Ruby fight off the Goblins and the Goblin King in Ruby's flat, but this was cut for budgetary reasons, so that could explain why it does feel a bit weird and feel like they're missing for quite a lot of the episode. And it just kind of makes them feel a little bit absent from the episode and almost like they're just working in the background. With that being said though, I really liked the moments in the flat between the Doctor, Ruby and Carla, so I can't really complain because it just means we got more of that, but it does affect the pacing a little bit with how long we don't see the Goblins for, and just know that they're up there somewhere until we get to see them again at the end. Speaking of the end, the final act at the church, like I said earlier on, I liked how well and seamlessly the intelligent gloves were set up earlier on in the episode. It makes the payoff of this moment a lot more effective and climactic, and it doesn't feel like it comes out of nowhere. And like I said, it just feels like a payoff. However, I do feel like it feels somewhat out of character for the Doctor to just Simon Skinner that Goblin, without at least trying to negotiate with them or something first. But with that being said, they do eat babies and tried to abduct Ruby and eat her as a baby, so maybe it's somewhat justified. It also feels a bit weird that the Goblin ship just disappears, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that on my first viewing. But then again, the Goblins are a new supernatural monster that we haven't previously had in the show and are only here thanks to the Toymaker. It does also feel weird that the Doctor doesn't follow the woman who abandoned Ruby at the church, but to be honest, this moment is something we'll likely return to at some point in season 1, as it's probably a big part of the overarching storyline. Also, I haven't yet talked about Davina McCall in this episode. I think she was a fun guest star to have in a Christmas special, but honestly, her acting's not the best, which is fair enough because she is a presenter by trade. I think her death in this episode was a good way to show how much of a threat the Goblins can be, and that they're not just slightly mischievous and eating babies. In a normal episode, I probably wouldn't really like the moment where the Doctor goes back to save her from the Christmas tree at the end, but because this is a Christmas special, I think it works just fine. However, I'm a bit unsure of how the Doctor knew about what happened to Davina in the first place. I guess we just have to assume that Ruby told him when they were tied up or something like that, or when they were going up the ladder. Maybe there's a deleted scene for that somewhere or something. And obviously, finally, this episode ends with Mrs. Flood breaking the fourth wall directly to the camera about asking if you've never seen a TARDIS before.
Never seen a TARDIS before.
Which I did feel like was a little bit weird and out of place, but I guess we'll just have to see what her character turns out to be in the future. Maybe this is just something she does and we don't quite know who she is yet, but even with that being said, it did feel a little bit weird and out of place. The first 2 episodes of Doctor Who Season 1 have finally aired, but were they any good? Okay, so I just wanted to do a quick video on my first impressions of the first 2 episodes of Doctor Who Season 1. I'm not going to be doing these first impression videos for any of the other episodes. It's basically just because we got these 2 episodes on the same day, and I might have to stagger out the reviews, which I am going to do. I'm going to do some full in-depth reviews for both of these episodes, 2 separate videos for them, but I might have to stagger those out a little bit more than I was originally planning, because when it comes round to the week where I'm going to review Boom, or when I'm meant to be recording the review for Boom, I'm going to be very busy that week, so I might be a bit late to doing the review for Boom. I might not have a chance to do it on that week that I was planning, and so I might have to stagger these reviews out a little bit more so that the Devil's Chord review comes out that week and the Boom review comes out the following week instead. So I thought, because it's going to be a while till I get my review out for the Devil's Chord and a little bit longer than I wanted to get my review out for Space Babies, I thought I'll give you a quick first impressions video instead. And another reason is because I don't know if you can tell from my voice, but I've got a bit of a cold at the moment, so I'm just not really feeling up for trying to work on a full review for Space Babies and the Devil's Chord right now. But it's mostly because I need to stagger these reviews out because I'm going to be busy for the Boom review. But yeah, once it comes around to after that point, I think I should be able to get them out pretty much as quickly as possible. So it's just for these first couple of reviews because of us getting 2 episodes in 1 week and how busy I'm going to be for episode 3. So I will probably talk about more of the plans of when I'm going to be releasing them later on in this video, but with that being said, let's talk about Space Babies. Okay, so Space Babies is a fairly standard Russell T Davies opener episode, in my opinion. It's maybe a little bit weirder than some of his other opening episodes, but when you think back to a lot of Russell T Davies, in particular, series openers, they're never really like the craziest or like best series openers ever. They're always just kind of like a standard run-of-the-mill episode that kind of introduces you to either the new companion, or for series 1 and this episode's case, introduces you to the Doctor and the whole concept of the show. We're just kind of a little fun romp happening in the background, which is definitely what this episode is, although it's probably a little bit more sillier than those ones. Although with that being said, we have had episodes like Partners in Crime with the Adipose, which is a little bit silly as well. But I think this episode does the job of that really well. Obviously, it's incredibly heavy on like the exposition about everything in the show, kind of introducing the new viewers to the show, which as a long-time viewer, it can be a little bit annoying having all these different things that we already know about introduced to us in the space of 1 episode, or I guess even like the first act of the episode, with the Doctor basically laying out who he is, what the TARDIS is, how the TARDIS works, discussing Gallifrey and Time Lords and all that stuff. But obviously, you've got to bear in mind, this is the first episode to be going on Disney+. It's the start of a brand new era. It's season 1 again, so it does kind of make sense why they're doing that, and it's just a little bit annoying for long-time viewers, but for brand new viewers, it works really well, and I think the exposition's done fairly well in this episode. They are throwing a lot at us, but like I said, it kind of makes sense because you've got to introduce these new Disney Plus viewers to the show. And as for the Doctor and Ruby, I think they're absolutely great in this. I've loved both of them even from the last episode we got, The Church on Ruby Road, but they just really shine in this episode. They're even better in this episode, and you can tell they're just having a lot of fun, and I really love the dynamic. And I've said previously in like the Church on Ruby Road review and stuff like that, that the 15th Doctor hasn't really had his Doctor moment yet. I feel like he pretty much has had that in this episode. He's even had a couple of moments like that in this episode, particularly when they're doing the whole kind of end of the world rehash kind of bit where they've opened the big window and are looking onto the planet, and the Doctor's kind of explaining why he does this stuff and what his life is like. That's a very Doctor-y moment, and also when he's talking to the babies, I think that's a very Doctor-y moment as well. So I will say he definitely has had his Doctor moment now, and you know, I've always felt like he is the Doctor. It's just that he hadn't had his Doctor moment before this, in my opinion. And yeah, I just love the playful energy between 15 and Ruby. I just think it's a great dynamic between the two. As for the plot of this episode, like I said, it's just a little bit of a silly one, a little fun romp. I thought the episode as a whole was just okay. I'll get more in depth with the actual plot when I do my full-on review, but overall I think this episode was just fine. There was some funny moments in there, and there was also some kind of scary moments in there, but I think it balanced the tone really well. I just think it was a generally fun episode, and you can tell it's meant to be an introduction to a new era for a lot of new fans that haven't seen the show before. But I do think it was definitely a very interesting choice as a first episode to introduce the new viewers, with just how kind of weird the whole concept of the Space Babies were. It could maybe be a little bit off-putting for some, but like I said, overall I think this episode was an okay episode and a very fun start to the season, but it's definitely not my favourite of the 2 episodes. So with that being said, let's talk about the Devil's Chord. Okay, so like I basically just said, The Devil's Chord is probably my favourite episode of the two. It's definitely my favourite episode of the two. As I said, I did like Space Babies. I think it was a good first episode. It was just kind of an okay episode as a whole, fairly standard, a fun romp, but overall nothing too crazy. Whereas The Devil's Chord was just an amazing episode. It's definitely up there with Wild Blue Yonder now for me in terms of the new era, and it just hit a lot better for me than the first episode did. I think Jinx Monsoon's Maestro was an incredible villain. I like how she's connected to the toy maker. It just kind of adds to the stakes of the episode. It's just a very quick way of showing how powerful this villain is. And once again, the Doctor and Ruby are incredible in this episode. They've got a great dynamic, as I said about the previous episode. It's a very different tone to the last episode. This one's definitely a lot more darker and serious. Although obviously with still having Maestro, there is kind of those over-the-top kind of campy moments in there. But ultimately, you do feel scared of this villain, and you feel the big threat, especially when they go to show what the world would be like if they don't stop Maestro. But with that being said, there are some bits of this episode that I'm not the biggest fan of, that kind of let it down a little bit for me. One of them, which isn't as big of a deal, is the Beatles are very underused in this episode, which I kind of expected. I did kind of theorize and predict that they weren't going to be in the episode a whole bunch, but it seems very weird to me that they only focus on John Lennon and Paul McCartney. I know they're the most famous Beatles, but it does kind of feel very weird that George and Ringo do kind of get sidelined as if they just never existed, which is very strange. But like I said, that wasn't too big of a deal for me, and I'll probably get more into that when I do my full in-depth review. And the other big issue I kind of had with this episode is the musical number at the end. Now, I was expecting a musical number at the end, and I was actually personally excited for a musical number at the end, but it just didn't kind of work as well as I wanted it to or expected it to. It felt very kind of out of place. It just kind of put it there completely out of left field. There wasn't really a build up to it. Like, obviously the whole music had returned thing, it does kind of make sense, but it just kind of felt like it'd been tacked on to the end for me. I know a lot of people have been saying that they kind of wish it was used as part of the big fight against Maestro instead of being after they got rid of Maestro, but I personally like how the fight against Maestro went, so I don't really agree with that. I just feel like there should have been more of a justification for that end musical number, and I also just don't think the music itself, the song itself for the musical number at the end was particularly that strong, so that's probably my least favourite part about that. And it also is just kind of very weird. I don't really know what it means, because they kind of breaking the fourth wall still a lot in that end musical number and after the musical number when they're kind of running along the piano keys of Abbey Road and stuff like that, and it's kind of like I'm kind of confused as to why that's happening. Now that Maestro is defeated and gone, it's kind of like, how are these magical things that the Doctor and Ruby are doing and making appear out of thin air happening? It's kind of very weird. But it's not that I'm against the whole fourth wall breaking stuff all in this episode. I liked a lot of the fourth wall breaking stuff, such as the non-diegetic joke and stuff like that. So although it sounds like I'm now having a lot of negative things to say about this episode, it was definitely my favourite of the two episodes we got. But one weird thing that I kind of want to talk about in regards to both of these episodes that I noticed, that might even follow on into the next episode, is I kind of noticed both of these episodes have a very small main cast and not much of a big kind of ensemble or guest cast as I was kind of expecting, or you kind of get from other Doctor Who episodes that we've had in the past. Obviously in episode 1 you've kind of just got the Doctor, Ruby and Jocelyn. Obviously you've got the Space Babies as well, but that's kind of just a whole group of babies. They're not really split up that much into individual characters besides maybe like Eric and maybe Captain Poppy, but then they kind of get sidelined a little bit after the first half of the episode, which I think was a good choice because they are a little bit distracting. So it is mostly just the Doctor, Ruby and Jocelyn. And then in terms of this episode, although we've got obviously the Beatles and Cilla Black and some of these other side characters at the start of the episode, as soon as the Maestro stuff kind of starts, it is mostly just the Doctor, Ruby and Maestro, and we just kind of forget about everyone else until obviously the Beatles come back again at the end. But once again, it's just John and Paul, and so it just kind of makes this cast of each of the episodes feel very small in my opinion, and I don't think that's going to change much for the next episode, Boom, with how limited the set is going to be and the concept of the episode. I feel like it's going to mostly just be focused on the Doctor and Ruby there as well, although we do know there's going to be more characters in the episode from the Next Time trailer. But I don't know, that's just kind of an observation I had about these first 2, maybe 3 episodes. It's not necessarily a negative or anything like that. I just thought it's very weird that we haven't had much guest cast or guest characters kind of in these episodes so far, besides some quick cameos from like the Beatles in episode 2 and obviously the Space Babies in episode 1. But let me know what you think about that. Like I said, it's not really a negative, it's just kind of something I noticed in the episodes. The first episode of Doctor Who Season 1 has finally aired, but was it any good? Okay, so I've already done my first impressions of this episode and the Devil's Chord. If you want to watch that video, I'll make sure to have it linked in the corner. But this video is going to be a much more in-depth review of the Season 1 opener, Space Babies. This episode sees Ruby learning the Doctor's amazing secrets as he takes her to a baby farm run by babies in the far future, with the terrifying bogeyman lurking below decks. But was it any good? Okay, so this episode opens immediately after the Church on Ruby Road, with some of the same shots and some new refilmed moments of what we'd already seen at the very end of that episode, kicking off right where we left off with Ruby's first adventure, which the Doctor sets to a random landing, taking them to the dinosaurs, where we get a fun butterfly effect moment, which we basically saw in the trailers. Now, this is a pretty fun scene overall, but it doesn't add too much to the episode, and it does feel a little bit disconnected, but I do think this is possibly a Disney edition, and it's not really a bad scene. It is kind of useful to kind of show the time traveling capabilities of the TARDIS and introduce it to new audiences on Disney Plus and any other new audiences that are watching. So like I said, this isn't like a bad scene or anything. It's a fairly fun scene, but for me personally, it doesn't add too much to the episode, and I do feel like it could have been a Disney Plus edition. And I think Ruby and the Doctor's chemistry in this episode is absolutely amazing, as can be said for the next episode as well. One of the standout moments of this in this episode is the Doctor's reaction to Ruby giving the 5 digits for the year when he's probably expecting just a 4-digit year. Now, there's also a lot of exposition in this episode, which is expected. This is the start of a new era, and it's introducing the show to a new audience, particularly those on Disney Plus. So I get why it's in here, but there is quite a lot of it in this episode. Now, it does mostly feel natural. A lot of it is motivated by Ruby asking the Doctor questions. However, some of the exposition in this episode that the Doctor gives does sometimes feel a little bit unmotivated and unprompted, with the Doctor just randomly telling Ruby things that she hasn't asked about. But like I said, it does kind of make sense because they need to introduce these things to a new audience, but some of it could have been done a little bit more naturally, and some of it was. We also get a hint at Ruby's story arc in this episode, with a chilling scene of the Doctor and Ruby's memory of the Church on Ruby Road bleeding through into reality, with the snow coming through into the spaceship, which like I said was just a really chilling scene and a really good way at hinting at the story arc that we're going to get in the future. But I'll talk more about Ruby's story arc in my review for the Devil's Chord. So obviously in this episode we have the titular Space Babies, which is a very silly concept but quite a fun idea. It's definitely an odd choice for the opening episode of the season, unless you count the Church on Ruby Road as the opening episode. But then again, we did have Partners in Crime, which had Living Fat in that episode, so it's not too far off a standard RTD opener. This also allows for us to finally get a Doctor moment for Ncuti Gatwa's 15th Doctor, where he's talking to Captain Poppy, explaining to them that they haven't grown up wrong and that nobody grows up wrong, which I think is a really nice message for this episode, and like I said, a very Doctor-y moment, which I'm glad we finally got to see from the 15th Doctor, and it obviously sets up the ending of this episode quite nicely. I've seen a lot of people complaining about the CGI of the talking babies, which, while it doesn't look the best, such as the reactions on their faces not suiting the dialogue, I think the effect is done as well as it could have been. So I don't really know what people would have wanted besides them maybe talking telepathically or something along those lines, but for me personally, I don't think it looks too bad for as well as it could have been done, basically. For me personally, it wasn't too distracting, but it definitely helps that the babies take a bit of a backseat after we're introduced to Jocelyn. And talking about the Space Babies, the Doctor does say Space Babies maybe one too many times, and it did start to get a little bit annoying. We're also introduced to the character of Jocelyn, or Nan-E, who was a very fun character. I really liked the introduction of this character, at first thinking that she was just an AI, for her then to get annoyed at the Doctor and break character, telling him to hurry up. And on those same lines, the Nan-E filter allows for a lot of fun comedic moments with censoring of expletives throughout this episode as a kind of running joke. The character of Jocelyn also allows for a really nice emotional moment in this episode, where she explains why she's been hiding away from the babies, as she doesn't want to see them die or for them to see her die as well. There's also some really good political commentary in this episode, with a focus on reproductive rights, with the babies being forced to be born but there being no obligation or assistance to look after them, with Ruby making a comment that it's not unlike our world, which definitely feels like a bit of a jab at the US right now. As well as this, there's also the political commentary on refugees, with the planet that accepts refugees not coming to collect them, as you physically have to show up there. However, although I do think this political commentary is good, that is basically the extent of the political commentary in this episode. It's just a couple of lines that aren't really elaborated on throughout the rest of the episode, so they maybe could have gone a little bit further there, but I do think it was still done really well, and was definitely some good moments for this episode. We obviously also have the Bogeyman in this episode, which I think was a very fun, fairly standard Doctor Who monster that works really well for an opening episode. I think the hints at where it came from are very clever in this episode, not giving it away too quickly. Although I had seen people speculating that the monster would have been made out of bogies before the episode had aired, so I kind of figured it out a little bit early on. But I particularly like the Doctor being confused as to why he ran away, for it to be revealed that it's because it was created with the intention of it being scary for the babies. I really liked the comedy in the reveal of the Bogeyman being made out of bogies. Once again, the Doctor and Ruby's chemistry is just great in this episode, and that's a great showcase of that. And obviously this episode ends with the Doctor saving the Bogeyman, which is very characteristic of the Doctor, and it does make sense with it being the only one of its kind as set up earlier on in the episode. However, it does still feel a bit weird as it's made to be the antagonist of the episode. Obviously it's technically fine, as I assume the Bogeyman was never actually going to kill the babies, as it was only designed to scare them, not kill them. But I do feel like there could have been more of an attempt to get the audience to empathise with it after the reveal, as it still feels a bit weird that the Doctor wants to save it, even if it does make sense character-wise. Maybe there could have been a line hinting at the fact that it was weird that the Bogeyman didn't kill Eric when it easily could have done, or something along those lines, just to prove that it was only designed to scare them and not kill them. Because I can imagine a lot of the audience were left thinking that now they've left the Bogeyman alive, it's just going to kill the babies, which I'm pretty sure isn't the intention. Overall, I think this was a perfectly fine opening episode, if not a bit sillier than usual. It establishes the Doctor and Ruby's relationship and dynamic really well, and it also establishes the concepts of the show to new viewers in a pretty natural and organic way for the most part. Although, like I said, there are some unmotivated moments of exposition in this episode. And there's also some nice hints at the further story arcs of the season in there as well. Compared to previous RTD openers, I think it's actually very similar. In my opinion, his opening episodes usually aren't the best in terms of their plot, and this episode is exactly the same. His opening episodes are usually more about the characters and introducing the audience than they are about the actual plot of the episode, so I think this one is fairly standard in terms of RTD openers, if not a bit sillier than some of his previous ones. When it comes to opening episodes in Doctor Who, I think the Moffat era did a much better job at openers, so like I said, in my opinion, Space Babies is actually a fairly standard RTD opener. Like I said, I liked this episode for the most part, but overall it was just okay. It's definitely the weaker out of the two first episodes of this season, which obviously I'll get into more next week when I review The Devil's Chord. I think if I was to put this episode on a tier list, I'd probably rank it at C, maybe B tier at a push, but for now I think I'm going to leave it at C, and maybe I'll change it up later on when we get to see the rest of the episodes. The second episode of Doctor Who Season 1 has aired alongside the first, but was it any good? Okay, so as mentioned, this episode, The Devil's Chord, aired on the same day as episode 1, Space Babies, which I reviewed last week. If you want to see the review for that episode, I'll make sure to have it linked in the corner and at the end of this video. But this video is going to be a review for episode 2, The Devil's Chord. This episode sees the Doctor and Ruby travel to 1963 to see the Beatles, but they come face to face with Maestro, who is changing history by removing music from people's hearts, leaving the future of humanity at stake. But was this episode any good? Okay, so this episode opens with a very classic Russell T Davies cold open, introducing us to the main villain of the episode, Maestro, who I think is a great villain, portrayed incredibly by Jinx Monsoon, who I just think did an incredible job in this episode. I know for some people the performance is a little bit over the top, but for me personally, I think it works perfectly for this episode. Although Jinx Monsoon has recently come out as trans, the character of Maestro is stated to be non-binary in the cold open of this episode. Now, let me know if I'm speaking out of turn here, but I think the non-binary nature of this character really works in their favour, as after all they are a godlike entity, being the child of the toy maker. So them being non-binary I think really works to show how powerful and out of this world this character is, if that makes sense. They're a sort of nebulous entity, so I think making them non-binary and giving them that non-binary identity really helps to reinforce that. And like I just mentioned, Maestro is confirmed to be a child of the toy maker and part of the pantheon and a god of chaos, which I think is a really clever way of setting the stakes of this villain, and a really easy way to relay to the audience how powerful of a force they are, as anybody who's seen the 60th anniversary specials and particularly the Giggle knows just how powerful this character should be if they are a child of the toy maker. And this also really helps to reinforce the Doctor's fear when he figures out who Maestro is and that they're related to the toy maker with the Giggle early on in the episode. Okay, so the first scene we get after the cold open and the title sequence is with the Doctor and Ruby, and this is one of my favourite scenes we've had had of them so far. Once again, their dynamic is on full display, with the Doctor pretending he doesn't like Ruby's suggestion of going to see the Beatles to actually trick her and show how happy he is that she said that. I also love the moment and the shot we get of them changing into their 1960s outfits, even though it is a bit weird that Ruby is already in an outfit that wouldn't seem out of place in the first place. But like I said, it allows for us to have that really nice moment and that great shot of them changing into their outfits, which I think is one of the best directed shots we've had in the season so far. Now, the weird thing about this episode is there is a 6-month time jump for some reason, which I think was a very odd mention in the script, and for me personally, it's not really a good decision for the second episode of the season. I've seen some people mention that this might have been done to have a gap for Big Finish and other expanded media, which is fine, but if so, I feel like it should have been done later on in the season than it was here, because we're just getting used to the characters and we really want to see their relationship develop in these early episodes. So I think having a 6-month time jump in between episode 1 and 2 was a pretty big mistake in my opinion. I've seen some people speculate that this episode was originally intended to be later in the season, which I think is definitely likely. However, Ruby suggesting to go and see the Beatles early on in this episode sounds like it would have been her first request after their first adventure in Space Babies, and my personal theory for how this episode was going to start is that it was going to take place immediately after the first episode, with this adventure being Ruby's first suggestion after their first adventure, which would also have justified the 2-episode premiere, as these episodes could have taken place immediately after each other, which would have made a lot more sense in my opinion. And I'm personally surprised they didn't just ADR the scene where June or July of 2024 is mentioned instead of Christmas, because I'm pretty sure the Doctor is both far away enough and maybe even facing away from the camera that I think an overdubbed line in the scene would have worked pretty seamlessly. We also get mentions of the Doctor's granddaughter Susan in this episode, which I believe is the first time she's been properly mentioned by name in all of the new era, although I guess this is technically another new era anyway. Now, most of the exposition so far has been something that is important for the new audience to know and catch them up to speed, which this isn't. So it does feel like this is something that wouldn't be mentioned unless it's going to be brought up again later on in the season. And we do know that Susan Twist is playing a character called Susan Triad in the finale, so it's possible that there's a connection there, and maybe we're going to see Susan later on in the season, or Susan's going to be Susan Triad or related to Susan Triad or something along those lines. But let me know what you think about that in the comments below. We also have some more hints at Ruby's story arc in this episode, with more memories bleeding through into reality like in the previous episode, and Maestro mentions a character called the Oldest One who was apparently present during Ruby's birth. I know some people have been speculating recently that this could be the Trickster. I'm not sure how likely that is, but let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. And Maestro once again reminds us that the one who waits is coming, which some people have speculated could be Sutek, which I'd love if that was true, but I don't know how likely that is. Again, let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. But this could be more evidence that this episode was meant to air later in the season, possibly right before the finale, as I'm pretty sure Maestro says the one who waits is closer than we think, so you'd think that'd be a bit later on in the season. Obviously, this episode sees the Doctor and Ruby going to see the Beatles record their first album, only for them to see that the Beatles, Cilla Black, and this orchestra are all playing terrible music, which I think makes for one of the best moments in this whole episode. I love both of their reactions to all of the musicians playing terrible music. I think it's a hilarious moment of the episode, and I think the Ruby and Doctor's reactions are perfect. Although the quote-unquote bad music that the Beatles are playing honestly isn't too far off something the Beatles would have made. Think I Am the Walrus or Octopus's Garden, but it's still a hilarious moment nonetheless. Speaking of the Beatles, I knew they weren't going to feature heavily in this episode. My prediction was that they would be trapped in their instruments most of the episode, and so I don't really mind that much that they don't look a whole lot like the Beatles. However, I do think it is really unfortunate that George and Ringo are pretty much sidelined for this episode, with us only focusing on John and Paul. But with that being said, I do really like the conclusion to the threat being those two coming together to play the chord that banishes Maestro. And of course, this episode ends with a final big musical number. Now, for me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of musicals, but I was expecting a musical number in this episode and was personally quite excited for it because I wanted to see how they'd do it, and it's something new for Doctor Who. However, the musical number at the end of this episode just didn't work for me. It didn't feel justified in the plot at all for me and just felt ultimately a bit tacked on, and the song itself just also isn't very good. It's nearly as bad as the made up bad songs earlier on in the episode. I've seen some people suggest that it should have been used to defeat Maestro Maestro in the music battle instead, which, although being more justified in the plot, I personally wouldn't have preferred that, as I think the music battle sequence is perfect as it is, besides that one cringy music battle line. It also doesn't really make sense in the plot, as Maestro has already been defeated, so we're kind of left questioning why this is happening in the first place. I think the intention was meant to be that Maestro's domain was still lingering, like at the end of the Giggle. I'm pretty sure I've heard there was a line from the script that was not included or something like that that hinted at that, but I think there really needed to be a line or two in the episode explaining that, because it just wasn't clear and made the musical number feel even more tacked on than it already was. Overall, I think this was a very good episode of the show, with a great villain in Jinx Monsoon's Maestro. It is almost up there with Wild Blue Yonder for me, however it's slightly let down by the tacked on musical number at the end, which doesn't have much of a function in the plot, and by some poor mistakes in either editing or episode placement, with that 6-month time jump and potentially other things that were cut from the episode. If I were to rank this episode on a tier list, I'm mostly thinking I'd give it an A rank at the moment, but it could go down to a B rank depending on if my thoughts on it change a little bit later on down the line, and depending on the later episodes of this season, depending on how good they are. But for now, I'm going to put it at A rank, but maybe that'll change later on down the line. Stephen Moffat has returned for his first Doctor Who episode in nearly 7 years, and he may have just written a new all-timer. Okay, so I know I said I wasn't going to necessarily do any more of these first impressions videos, but I just thought because I'm going to be busy during the next week or so, and it's going to take me a while to get my Boom review out, and obviously I don't even have my Devil's Chord review out yet, although that is ready for early access now and will be going out on Friday. I just thought because of all that, I'm going to do a quick first impressions while I've got the chance on Boom, which I saw this morning. I'm now filming this in the evening because I've been at work all day. But yeah, let's just get straight into it. So, like I basically hinted at the intro of this video, I think Stephen Moffat has returned for another all-time episode, which I'm surprised he can do after obviously being the showrunner and writing like the most Doctor Who episodes out of any writer. It's genuinely impressive that he can come back and write another all-time classic, which is what I believe Boom is. This episode just is a masterclass in writing tension and building suspense. With such a simple plot of the Doctor stepping on a landmine, it's just incredibly done. Obviously, it allows for some great acting from both Ncuti Gatwa and Millie Gibson. This is probably the best they've both been in the whole series so far, particularly with Ncuti. Obviously Millie was great in this as well, but she is like dead for the last half or final act of this story, so particularly with Ncuti because he's just incredible in this episode. If I wasn't already sold on him as the Doctor, this episode certainly does sell you on him being the Doctor. He's incredible. Obviously there's also quite a few themes in this episode. The one I particularly latched onto the most is capitalism and its effect on war. Obviously the reveal that they're not fighting anybody, it was a little bit easy to figure out, but I feel like that's kind of intentional. You're meant to be able to kind of start piecing it together quite early on, because even the Doctor is kind of mocking the other characters for not figuring it out yet. But I think that commentary on capitalism and warfare was just incredible in this episode. There's obviously also commentary on AI and also commentary on faith, which I think was done really well in this episode. For me personally, I'm not really a person of faith. I don't subscribe to any religion, but even with that being said, I was kind of worried that the Doctor would just kind of be slating religion as a whole in this episode, and that would obviously annoy quite a few people. But I'm glad he does kind of see some reason behind it in the end, and I think that was a really nice thing to finish and cap this episode off at. In terms of the actual plot and the episode itself, I don't really know if I have much else to say right now. I'm going to obviously be trying to write down some thoughts for my review, so forgive me if I've not mentioned anything in specific right now. I do like a lot of the references in this, particularly some deep cuts like the whole villain guard thing, which I honestly forgot was a thing until people were pointing it out in the images that had been released before this episode aired, so I think that was really cool. And we obviously get a nice reference to Fish Fingers and Custard at the end of the episode. But yeah, like I said, I'll probably be saving a lot more specific details about this episode for my full in-depth review, which should be coming within the next couple of weeks. Probably not this coming Friday, because that's when my Devil's Chord review is going to be coming out, and like I said, I'm going to be quite busy this week, but probably the Friday after that. One other thing I should probably mention is the visual effects in this episode are absolutely incredible. Obviously, a lot of these visual effects were in camera because they used not technically the volume as they talked about in the commentary, but just a similar thing to the volume, which was that big LED screen. So a lot of these visual effects were in camera, and for that it just really makes this episode look incredible. And it makes a lot of sense to use that technology for this episode as well, because obviously the location that they're on for the majority of the episode, this one crater that they're in where the landmine is placed, is such such a small location, and they're obviously in that one place for pretty much the whole episode, so it makes sense to use this technology for that, and I think it works perfectly. And another thing to mention is obviously, well, I say obviously, although some people might not have noticed or only noticed after the episode, but Virada Sethu is in this episode playing Mundi, who I think was just a great character, and her relationship with the other character, I think his name was Kanto, was really good in this. They were both great in this episode, but it does leave me wondering what the situation with Virada Sethu and her being the companion is going to be. From watching Confidential, it sounded more like she just happened to be playing this character in this episode, and maybe Russell saw how good she was and decided she'd be great as the companion, who seems to be a different character, not the same returning character when she becomes the companion. But then in the commentaries, it sounds like it could maybe be a bit of a different thing. It sounds like it is maybe going to be linked somehow to this character, so I'm not really sure how it's going to be. Possibly kind of like Clara Oswald vibes or something like that, or maybe it is just going to be the same character returning, but I doubt it is the same character. So let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. What do you think the whole thing with Virada Sethu returning as the companion is going to be about, and do you think it's going to be linked to this episode? And whilst we're on the topic of talking about Stephen Moffat episode and Stephen Moffat's return, because I haven't made a whole dedicated video to this or anything, we obviously now know that Stephen Moffat is officially returning for the Christmas special this year, which is very interesting. After this episode, I'm really excited to see it. It's going to be called Joy to the World. We know Nicola Coughlan's going to be in it. And yeah, it is very interesting because usually the showrunner is the one who writes the Christmas specials. So it's interesting this time around that we're actually getting somebody else that isn't the showrunner or the current showrunner writing the Christmas special this time around. But I will say, for me personally, although I like a lot of Russell T Davies' Christmas specials, Moffat's Christmas specials on the whole were usually a lot better, particularly during the start of his era, but some of the other ones were quite good as well. I'm thinking mostly like Christmas Carol and stuff like that. Some really great Christmas specials from Moffat. So especially after this episode and from his previous Christmas specials, I'm very excited to see him write in this year's Christmas special, Joy to the World. So let me know what you think about that as well in the comments down below. Stephen Moffat has returned to pen his first Doctor Who episode since 2017, but was it good? Okay, so of course I've already done my first impressions video on Boom, and as well by this point my review for The Devil's Chord should be out, but this is going to be my full in-depth review of Boom, and by the time I'm recording this, 73 Yards hasn't aired yet, but the review for that should be coming out within the next week or so. So I know I've said it before, but I'm probably not going to have any more first impressions videos after this point, as I should be able to get the reviews out a bit quicker than I've been doing previously. But with that being said, this episode sees the Doctor and Ruby land in the middle of a battlefield on Castarian 3, with the Doctor stepping on a landmine where he has to save the entire planet without moving. But was this episode any good? Okay, so this episode opens with a fairly extended cold open, perfectly setting up all the threads in this episode, such as the ambulances not being a good thing in this scenario, the effect the landmine has and how it works, as well as the guest characters that are relevant to the episode. And it does all of that, as well as the Doctor stepping on a landmine before the titles even start. We're also introduced to Virada Sethu's character in this cold open of this episode, who I thought did a great job in this story, and I'm very excited to see her return again next season as the companion, presumably as a new character from what we can tell, but it might somehow be related to this character in some way. But I talked more about that in the first impressions video. We did know she was going to be showing up earlier than season 2, but I wasn't expecting it to be this early, and it was a nice surprise. And like I said, I think she was great in this episode. We also get a number of other guest characters in this episode. Obviously there's the relationship between Mundi and Kanto, which although wasn't the most convincing thing ever, I did genuinely cry when Kanto dies and she's speaking to the hologram. But I can see why some people didn't quite believe their relationship. And I can also see what some people were saying with the casting of Splice. It does seem like she was meant to be maybe played by a younger actor, and that would have probably worked a little bit better, but you know, casting for child actors is probably not the easiest thing in the world. As mentioned, this episode mostly consists of the Doctor being stuck on a landmine for most of the episode, unable to move, and I just think this episode is a masterclass in tension and suspense from Stephen Moffat, particularly the moment where Splice is running towards the Doctor and Ruby has to try and stop her, as well as the moment where Ruby is shot and the Doctor can't do anything about it. I think those moments were just great and really suspenseful and had a lot of tension in them. But just overall, this whole episode was incredibly tense, and Ncuti Gatwa and Millie Gibson's performance performances were incredible, particularly Ncuti Gatwa, as obviously Millie Gibson, or Ruby Sunday I should say, was dead for a lot of the episode, or dying for a lot of the episode, so was out of action for quite a lot of it. And if you weren't already convinced that Ncuti Gatwa is the Doctor before this episode, you certainly should be now. Now, as mentioned, there are a number of different themes throughout this episode, one of which is the theme around AI, particularly with the ambulances and the villain guard algorithm, which I've seen some people aren't the biggest fan of this theme, because it seems to be suggesting that AI isn't bad unless it's good AI, or that AI is bad until it isn't. However, I personally didn't read it that way. I personally took this as a message of humanity over AI, with the AI of John Francis Veta representing the humanity defeating the AI, not just that his AI is a good AI and the AI can be good, but I can personally see how people read it that way instead. As mentioned in my first impressions video, I think the theme that I latched onto the most was definitely the capitalism and warfare theme throughout this episode, and the revelation of the Anglicans actually fighting nobody, they're on an empty planet, although easy to predict, was a great one in my opinion. There is of course the theme of faith and religion throughout this episode as well, with the Doctor almost criticising faith in a way throughout the episode, but I think it's nice that it ends on a positive note with the Doctor seeing the benefits of it at the end of the episode. I know a lot of people are very annoyed about the Doctor's reaction or thoughts on faith in this episode, and they think it's very out of character for the Doctor, which I can see, but like I said, he does come around to it in the end, and I think a big part of that is just that he's obviously going to be a lot more spiteful early on in the episode, whilst he's stuck on a landmine, and you know, he thinks Ruby's dead and there's nothing he can do about it, so I can kind of understand why he's more spiteful towards the other characters about faith and religion at the start, and why he's much more accepting of it at the end, when you take into consideration that he's under a lot of stress and pressure throughout the episode. So for me personally, I think it works quite well. Now, there's also a number of references in this episode, not only to previous Moffat episodes such as Villain Guard, the Anglican Marines, Fish Fingers and Custard, and the Doctor saying basically in a similar way to how he says basically run as the 11th Doctor, but also references to other eras such as the Doctor singing the Skyboat song, which is a song that the second Doctor has played on his recorder, as well as the reference to the mud aliens from the Witchfinders. I appreciate a lot of these references because they're kind of, some of them are almost like deep cuts, such as Villain Guard that was only barely mentioned in Empty Child Doctor Dances. Some of them are a little bit more obvious, like Fish Fingers and Custard, but I appreciate that Moffat returned and didn't just write like another Weeping Angel story or reintroduce the silence or something like that. So I think these references are quite nice, and it's obviously nice that some of the references aren't just to previous Moffat era episodes or episodes that Moffat has written before. There's obviously a few more story arc hints throughout this episode as well, with Ruby not knowing who her next of kin is, and the snow showing up again in the episode, which I think is very interesting to see. And also obviously Susan Twist is in this episode as well. I think my only issue with all of these story arc hints throughout the past few episodes is that we've had the same hints with the snow and Susan Twist in every episode so far. I think that's just kind of a downside of having a shorter episode count for this season, but it would have maybe been nice if we had these hints maybe every other episode instead of every episode as well. But there's obviously more hints at the Doctor's family as well in this episode, with him saying things like dad to dad and stuff like that, which could be more hints towards Susan returning towards the end of this season or at some point in this era, but let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. Overall, I think this episode was a masterclass in tension and suspense, and in my opinion, it's a new all-timer from Stephen Moffat. This episode explores some great themes around AI, capitalism and warfare, and faith, with some nice references to not only previous Moffat episodes, but also other episodes from both the classic era and modern eras of the show. I'd personally say this is probably my favourite episode of the 15th Doctor era so far, and in terms of the RTD2 era, it's definitely up there with Wild Blue Yonder, probably the best episode since that. So for that reason, I'm mostly thinking of putting this episode in S tier, with the potential for it to be moved down to A tier if anything in this season somehow tops this episode. With that being said, I am incredibly excited for 73 Yards, which by the time this video is out will have already aired, but that is definitely the episode I've been most intrigued for this whole season, so we'll see how well that goes. Russell T Davies has previously stated that 73 Yards is the best thing he's ever written, but is that true? 73 Yards sees the Doctor and Ruby landing on the Welsh coastline in modern day, where the Doctor immediately steps on a fairy circle. Seriously, the Doctor and Ruby need to start watching where they're stepping in this season. This leads to the Doctor vanishing, with Ruby being left on her own for the whole episode, constantly being followed by a mysterious woman who is always 73 yards away from her. As some of you may know, 73 Yards was the episode of this season of Doctor Who that I was the most intrigued in and most excited for. For that reason, I think when I first watched this episode, it didn't quite live up to the expectations I had built up in my head for it. However, after seeing other people's takes on this episode on Twitter, particularly the negative reactions to this episode, I realised I liked it a lot more than I had first thought. And the more I thought about this episode, the more I liked it. And I knew that on rewatch, I was going to enjoy this episode a lot more. With that being said, there are still a few criticisms I have for this episode, so let's get into the review. So obviously, like I said, the Doctor disappears at the start of this episode, which leaves Ruby Sunday on her own for the rest of the episode as the main character of this episode. This gives Millie Gibson the perfect opportunity to shine as Ruby Sunday in this episode, where she gives a great performance, which is really impressive considering this is the first episode she filmed of this season. If Boom is the episode that should sell you on Ncuti Gatwa as the Doctor, then 73 Yards is the episode that should sell you on Millie Gibson as Ruby Sunday. So Ruby also bumps into Susan Twist again in this episode as the hiker, but this time she actually recognizes her from the previous episode, forwarding this Susan Twist story arc a little bit further than it has been for the past few episodes, where the Doctor and Ruby haven't even really noticed her before. We then get a very good and tense scene in the pub. I know some people don't really like its portrayal of Welsh people, but bear in mind this is written by Russell T Davies, who is himself Welsh. I love the reveal of them just messing with Ruby. It makes you unsure of how much, if any, of what they said is actually true or real. I personally think none of it is real and it's just a red herring, but it's a really nice way of sowing some seeds of what could be happening in this episode and what the explanations could be, leaving the audience to kind of figure out which of the things they've said is actually true and actually happening. We also get the scenes with Ruby's mum, Carla, as well as Kate Stewart and Unit, where they're both turned away from Ruby after speaking to the woman, which really just shows how alone Ruby is with all this and how no one is able to help her. And the scene with Kate Stewart has a really great line in it, which I think is very important to this episode, but I'll touch on that more later on. So after all this happens, we then get a time jump to Ruby when she's about 40, I think. It is a little bit weird that the way that they've decided to age her up is basically just by putting glasses on her. I'm pretty sure from Unleashed you can see that she does technically have some prosthetics on. There's like some slight wrinkles in her forehead and stuff like that. And I think she was also coached on how to walk as if she was a 40-year-old, but that's honestly not that noticeable, so it does kind of just look like they've put some glasses on her, which is kind of funny. But for me personally, it doesn't really bother me that much. I thought Roger Ap Gwilliam was a good antagonist for this episode. My only issue is how long it takes to get to him and how little he's focused on in the episode. I know I've seen some people that aren't so happy about the whole abuse that is implied in this episode, which I fully appreciate and understand. For me, I think it really helps to show how terrible and obsessed with power he is, but I can see why those implied moments just kind of really aren't needed for some people and feel a little bit weird. In terms of Roger Ap Gwilliam himself, I think my personal interpretation is I personally like to think that he's just a normal human who is obsessed with power, and that him mentioning that his nickname was Mad Jack is just a coincidence that reminds Ruby of the Doctor mentioning him and what he did at the start of the episode. Hence why when Ruby uses the woman to make Roger Ap Gwilliam resign, she doesn't disappear until Ruby dies, as I think that's not what she was there for. I personally think there isn't actually a reason why the woman is there, but Ruby just finds one and makes one up, which I think is hinted at by what Kate says earlier on in the episode, where she says, "It's what we do, all of us. We see something inexplicable and invent the rules to make it work." However, other people obviously are going to interpret this in a different way. That Mad Jack is an entity set free by the Doctor stepping in the fairy circle that is either possessed or manifested into Roger Ap Gwilliam, which I think is just as valid of an interpretation, and personally what this episode is all about. The ambiguity of elements like this is personally what makes this episode so good in my opinion, but I'll get into that more later on. But before I get into most people's main issue with this episode, I think my main issue with this episode is the pacing and the political elements that seem a little bit rushed and half-baked. They sort of come out of nowhere, and I feel like this episode could have maybe benefited from being a two-parter, especially considering you can tell that they've tried to fit a lot into this episode, and it still ended up being 47 minutes long, which is longer than all the other episodes we've got so far in this season, and they still couldn't fit a title sequence at the start of this episode, although that might have been a creative decision. Either way, I think the lack of title sequence works for this. But yeah, I do think this maybe could have benefited from being a two-parter, with part one ending with with Ruby seeing Roger Ap William on the TV announcing that he is running for Prime Minister, and her remembering what the Doctor said about him. And then part 2 focusing on the political elements and Ruby trying to take down Roger Ap William. Okay, so obviously a lot of people weren't happy with the ending of this episode as it leaves a lot of things unexplained. However, whilst I understand that criticism, it personally doesn't bother me. I personally like that this episode doesn't have an explanation for anything at the end. I think people are just so used to Doctor Who having a technobabble explanation behind it, but I think this episode really benefits from not having one, as it allows for some really unique and interesting interpretations, with people interpreting a lot of the elements of this episode in different and creative ways, such as my interpretation with Roger Ap William. The comparison I made on Twitter is you wouldn't watch Donnie Darko, for example, and complain that nothing in that film makes sense. The whole point of that film and this episode is that it's all up to the viewer's interpretation. The difference here is that Doctor Who is a sci-fi show that usually has a logical explanation to everything, although I guess technically Donnie Darko is sci-fi horror, which this episode sort of is as well. However, with that being said, I do understand some of the criticisms. For example, if Ruby is the woman, why would she say something so horrible to her own mum? I think that doesn't make too much sense when you think about it, but personally I don't think the solution to that would be knowing what the woman is saying. Not knowing what the woman was saying is personally one of my favourite things about this episode, as it leaves a lot to the audience's imagination, and whatever it would have been revealed to be is not going to be as good as what you could think of in your head, or what you don't know. So I really don't know what they could have done there. Maybe not making Ruby be the woman or something like that, but I personally don't think finding out what the woman was saying is the solution to that. The woman also isn't played by the same person who plays the older version of Ruby, so I guess maybe Ruby only inhabits the woman's body for a short period of time at the end or something like that. I think the main difference in whether or not people came out of this episode enjoying it or not mostly came down to how people approached the episode. I feel like people who didn't really like this episode or are annoyed about the ending of this episode approached this as a mystery that was going to be solved, which isn't really their own fault. But myself, and I assume the other people who also really liked this episode, were just along for the ride and saw it as more of an episode that was taking us on a journey. A lot of people are also annoyed, saying that all of this was pointless because Ruby doesn't remember it and lost all of her character growth, but I personally disagree with that, because she says at the end of the episode that she's been to Wales 3 times instead of 2 times like she said at the start. So although she doesn't actually seem to remember any of it, it's definitely stayed with her somehow, which to me suggests that the character growth that she gets in this episode has also stayed with her, even if she can't fully remember what happened. I've also seen a lot of people saying that they hope we get more answers later on in the season about this episode, but I personally don't hope we get any answers later on in the season, and I don't think we will. Like I said, for me, the ambiguity is what makes this episode, and so explaining things later on down the line would personally ruin it for me. And I also think it just seems like this story is finished, as much as people would like some explanations for it. I just personally don't see it being revisited, and personally don't want it to be, but that's just my opinion. Overall, I think 73 Yards is a great episode that thrives on ambiguity. However, some of the political content in this episode does feel somewhat rushed and half-baked, and could have maybe benefited from being 2 parts. This episode leaves you with more questions than answers, which for the most part I think is to its benefit, and leaves you thinking about it long after it's finished. However, some of the questions do bring up some genuine criticisms, such as if the woman is meant to be Ruby, why would she say something so horrible to her own mum and turn her against herself? But for the most part, I think this episode wouldn't work without its ambiguity, as it leads to a lot of creative interpretations, which I think was intentional. With that being said, I can see why this episode didn't land for some people, especially if they approached it as a mystery to be solved instead of a journey, which is no fault of their own. Because of the high expectations I had for this episode, after my first viewing I was mostly thinking of ranking this episode underneath Boom, but the more I thought about this episode, the more I liked it, and after a second viewing of this episode I really loved it. So I'm now thinking of ranking this alongside Boom in S tier. Obviously the next episode is Dot and Bubble, which from the Next Time trailer didn't get me too excited for it, but I have got a little bit more excited by some of the reviews and the ideas of class commentary, as well as just the social media commentary, which is a lot more exciting in my opinion. Okay, so I know I've obviously said I'm not going to be doing many of these first impressions videos again, and I think that's pretty much still the stance that I'm going to have. I'm not necessarily going to do a first impressions video for every episode, mostly because I don't always have the chance to record them, but for this one in particular I felt like it was the kind of right episode to get some first impressions out, because there's definitely some initial thoughts I have on this episode that I really want to get out before I make my full in-depth review. For this episode, Dot and Bubble, you might remember from 73 yards, the review I did on 73 yards, that I said I wasn't really looking forward to this episode that much. I had quite low expectations going into this episode from particularly the Next Time trailer, because it looked like it was just kind of going to be an episode that was just about social media, kind of Black Mirror episode where it's just kind of like the episode Nosedive basically from Black Mirror, if any of you are familiar with that. That's kind of the impression I was getting, and I wasn't really excited to see Russell's take on social media and why social media is bad, because Russell's like 60 years old and I just was worried it was going to be really cringy and boomer humor and stuff like that. So I went in with those quite low expectations, but luckily that is not what we got at all with this episode, and I was completely surprised by this episode. Now, there definitely are still elements of the social media commentary in this episode, but that's really only a small part of this episode, and I think a lot of people have really misinterpreted a lot of the stuff in this episode as just social media commentary. Particularly, I think the people that didn't really like this episode, or that it didn't really stick with them that much. Because like I said, the social media aspect of this story is a very small part of this story, and I think the main social commentary of this episode is actually around social divisions, particularly class and race, and not really about social media. Obviously, there is the whole social media thing in there with the dot and the bubble that people are using, but I don't think the actual commentary itself is particularly focused too much on social media. Besides stuff like obviously people being in their own bubble, their own echo chambers, and people kind of distracting themselves with social media from the real world and real world problems, which is definitely a factor in this. But like I said, I think the main thing with this episode is actually the commentary on social divisions. Obviously, for most of the episode, it's particularly around class, with obviously the people on Fine Time just being the rich kids, but obviously as well with the final scene at the end, there's obviously social commentary on racism there, which I know somehow a lot of people didn't actually get that, and they thought that it was just the Doctor and Ruby being treated as outsiders, even though for me personally I think it was pretty obvious, especially with a lot of it being focused on the Doctor and not Ruby, and a lot of the lines they say are very clearly racist. So for me personally, I don't really see how people didn't get that. I know there's also still some people saying that it isn't meant to be that, but it is, because Russell T Davies has stated that in Unleashed, that that's what that scene was about. Now, I don't know if the reason that I understood it straight away is just because I happened to accidentally read the leak that kind of said this was going to happen at the end of the episode, but I don't think that is the case. I think personally I would have got this straight away, because I also rewatched it later on with my girlfriend and she completely understood it straight away. I didn't need to explain it to her. It's very clear to both of us that that's what this scene was about. Now, I feel like it is worth mentioning that both me and her are just about to graduate from university with a sociology degree, but I personally don't think that's why we understood it that way. I think it's just because it's been made very clear in the episode, both in the text and also like the subtext throughout the episode. So for me personally, I do find it a little bit difficult to understand how people didn't quite get it. The thing I do kind of understand is some people initially thinking that it was a little bit out of nowhere at the end, which I personally think it isn't, but I can see why people didn't pick up on some of the subtle hints throughout the episode. For me personally, I was picking up on those, but once again, that could have been because I kind of saw the leak beforehand, so I kind of suspected it could be building up to that, so I was picking up on a lot of those indications early on. But I can see why some people might not have picked up on that. But that's why I think this episode is really beneficial for having a rewatch, because you can pick up on those things later on and see where it was going and think, oh, this should have been quite obvious to me. So I personally think that was done really well, and I don't think it was out of nowhere at the end. I think it was very nicely and subtly set up throughout the episode. But yeah, anyway, that all leads up to this final scene, which I'm going to talk about all these things in a lot more detail in my full review, which will be coming in the next week or so. But I do think that final scene is really what makes this episode stand out for me. It genuinely might be the best moment from this season so far. I mean, this episode is not the best episode in this season, in my opinion. I still really enjoyed it, but that scene is definitely the standout scene for me in the season as a whole so far, and the standout Doctor moment, which is just crazy to think, because obviously, for those who don't know, I guess at least, this was actually the first scene that Ncuti Gatwa filmed as the Doctor for the season. I think he did the stuff for the Giggle before this point, but this was the first thing he filmed for season 1. So it's incredible that he managed to pull that off in his first scene. But yeah, like I said, this scene is what really makes this episode, and it is a standout moment for both this Doctor and for this season of the show. With that being said, I don't think this episode is perfect. I did like it a lot more than I was expecting, like I mentioned, but I do definitely still have some issues with this episode. They are kind of only minor issues, but they do let it down a little bit. The first thing is, I feel like the pacing in the middle of this episode particularly, it does kind of meander a little bit. There's a lot of them just kind of sitting around and talking to each other through the screens, which completely makes sense, but it does kind of leave the pacing to kind of meander in the middle, because I think this episode has a really great setup and a really great conclusion conclusion, but I feel like Russell then kind of had to fill in the gaps a little bit in the middle and didn't do the best job of doing that. But I still think it works. It just could have maybe been done a little bit better during the kind of middle act of this episode. But as well as that, the other probably main issue I have with this episode is the whole thing with the slugs and the dot system, and basically the reveal of that the slugs are killing people in alphabetical order, because I really just don't see why they were doing that. We obviously get the moment later on in the episode where the dot just kills Ricky September by going straight through his head, and it's kind of like, well, number one, if they could do that this whole time, why haven't they just been doing that with everybody else? And number two, what is actually the reason behind them choosing to do it alphabetically? And I feel like the whole alphabetical thing was kind of just there so we could have a moment where the Doctor figures out what's going on, and also so we could have the twist where Lindy decides to basically sacrifice Ricky September so that she can escape. But I feel like that's kind of the only reason the alphabetical stuff was in there, because otherwise it's kind of like, for what reason would they be doing it alphabetically? And for me as well, I was just kind of expecting that mystery to be something a little bit more satisfying when it was solved, because when we find out it's just that they're doing it alphabetically, it's kind of like, yeah, but why are they doing that? And I feel like they could have picked a reason that played a lot more into the social commentary of this episode. For example, I think they mentioned on the Review of Death podcast this morning that it could have been maybe based on their follow account, so the people with the lowest amount of followers or something like that was the ones that were being picked off first, which I think would have made a lot more sense, because not only would it have worked because it would have played into the social media commentary a little bit more, but it also works because it's kind of like people aren't going to notice what's happening straight away because it's the people with the lower followers, and they're only going to start noticing when it's the people with the really high like subscriber counts and stuff like that, even if it's been going on for a while now. So I think that would have worked a lot better than the alphabetical order, but I think the reason the alphabetical thing was picked was just so we could have the twist basically of Lindy Pepperbean sacrificing Ricky September so that she could escape. But those are my main issues with this episode. Besides that, I actually really liked it and was pleasantly surprised by it, because I had quite low expectations going into this episode. If you want an indication of where I'm going to be ranking this episode, obviously I'm not going to be doing that until my review comes out, but basically from my first watch of this episode I was quite surprised by it because of the low expectations, but I still thought it was a fairly mid episode with just one incredible scene at the end. But then, similar to 73 Yards, the more I thought about this episode and the more I saw people talking about it online, the more I was kind of like, okay, this episode is actually a lot better than I remember and definitely deserves to go up a rank or two. And then after rewatching it, it was even better, and I'm starting to think now that it's one of the best episodes of the season. So it definitely climbed up the ranks just in the space of a day that it came out for me. So that's definitely an indication of what kind of ranking it's going to be getting when I get around to doing the review. I don't completely know where I'm going to put it yet, but that's just a little indication of where that's going to be. Dot and Bubble was the episode of Doctor Who Season 1 that I was the least excited for, but was it actually good? Okay, so like I just mentioned, this episode was probably the episode of Doctor Who Season 1 that I was the least excited for. I expected it to be a very cringy boomer take on social media and being obsessed with smartphones, and I honestly expected it to be the low point of this season. But luckily enough, although there is definitely some of that in this episode, that's not all this episode was about, and I was actually pleasantly surprised by this episode. So Dot and Bubble sees the residents of Fine Time, children of the rich elite, living inside their social media bubble as they are slowly being eaten by slug creatures known as man-traps, with the Doctor and Ruby trying to save them through their screens. But was this episode actually any good? Okay, so at the start of this episode, we're introduced to our main character and audience POV, Lindy Pepperbean. I think Lindy Pepperbean was portrayed brilliantly by Callie Cook. I know some people have an issue with how unlikable she is, especially considering she's the main character of the episode. And while I do understand that, I think that Callie Cook and also the writing of this episode did a great job at making us think that as annoying as this character is, she could still be redeemed by the end of the episode. Although we obviously now know that didn't end up happening, which I think is a great twist that I'll get to later on in this review. As well, the Doctor and Ruby don't appear a whole lot throughout this episode, which I know some people have been slightly annoyed at because we just had a Dr. Light episode the week before. But for me, their presence is definitely felt a lot more in this episode, and I would agree with some of the early reviews of this episode saying that it's more of a Dr. Light-ish story than a Dr. Light episode. If this episode was completely Dr. Light like the week before, I could see them being back-to-back as being a lot more of an issue than this episode actually is. Because like I said, I think their presence is felt a lot more throughout this episode. So the social commentary in this episode is probably my favourite part about this episode, and definitely the thing that surprised me the most about this episode, because like I mentioned, I initially thought the social commentary in this episode was just going to be about social media and being obsessed with being on your phone, not looking what you're doing, and just kind of scrolling through social media wherever you are, which I was really worried about, especially with it being written by Russell T Davies, who's in his 60s now. So I was worried that this social media commentary was going to be quite bad, and while this social media commentary is in there, and there's definitely a lot of those negatives in there that I was worried about, I personally think the social media commentary is actually only the smallest part of the social commentary in this episode, and I think a lot of people have misinterpreted the rest of this episode as just being that social media commentary, when in actuality I think the main point of this episode and the main social commentary is around social divisions, particularly with classism and elitism, with some people even misconstruing the ending of this episode as also being about classism and elitism. And while that definitely does play a part in the final scene of this episode, to me and a lot of other people it was very clear that that final scene is meant to be mostly about racism, but obviously still with hints of classism and elitism in there. But I'll get more onto the final scene later on. Now, this middle act of the episode is where one of my main issues with this episode arises, and that's the pacing issues, because this part of the episode is where the pacing really starts to meander a little bit for me, because the middle of the episode sees the characters mostly just sat in one place talking to each other over their screens. For example, I think the scene where Lindy Pepperbean is at work, along with the scene where she is hiding from the slugs and talking to the doctor, both go on for a little bit too long, which leads to the pacing really meandering a lot in the middle. But I can understand this because obviously a lot of the episode does kind of need to consist of people talking through screens. It's just kind of unfortunate that they are kind of sat in one place for a long time. Now, the pacing of this episode definitely starts to pick up a bit again when we're finally introduced to Ricky September in the flesh. Ricky September is probably one of my favourite characters in this episode, because you really don't expect him to be the best person in this story, besides obviously the Doctor, because when we're first introduced to him in the cold open of this episode, he just seems like he's just like everybody else, dancing along to some music and posting these dances on social media and being trapped in his bubble like everybody else in Fine Time. But when we finally meet him, we realise he's not like that at all, and he actually spends most of his time outside of the bubble with his dot turned off. Now, when I was watching this episode, I realised Ricky was giving off a lot of Doctor vibes, as he was pretty much acting exactly like the Doctor would, which I didn't really understand when I was first watching the episode. But a lot of people have pointed this out since watching the episode, that this Doctor analogy was probably intentional, because it shows that Lindy would have trusted the Doctor if he was white, because Ricky acts pretty much exactly like the Doctor and Lindy trusts him straight away, which I definitely think was the intention behind this. Now, a lot of people still aren't sure whether or not we should like Ricky or not, because there's a possibility that he could also be racist as well. But for me personally, I definitely read it as him not being that, because as we know, he spends most of his time outside of the bubble, which is meant to be kind of an analogy for this echo chamber that they're all in. And we also know that he's spent his time reading up on a lot of history, and he also seems a lot less confrontational and more accepting when speaking to the Doctor, in my opinion. So for me personally, I do think Ricky is a good character, and I think the intention behind him was that he isn't meant to be racist like everybody else. We then get the reveal that the Dots have created the man-traps and have been killing the residents of Fine Time in alphabetical order, which if you've seen my first impressions video on this episode, you'll know I wasn't the biggest fan of this reveal. Now, I have slightly been swayed on the idea of them killing in alphabetical order now, after some discussions on Twitter and stuff like that, as people have pointed out that this kind of would make sense considering the Dot is basically a computer system and an algorithm, so it kind of makes sense that it would kill in alphabetical order, which I do agree with, and I have slightly been swayed on that opinion, but I still think it would have been a good idea to maybe have the reveal be something slightly different, such as the follow account suggestion that I mentioned in my first impressions video, just so that it could be something a little bit more satisfying and could play into the social commentary aspect of this episode a lot more. I'm also not too keen on the idea of the Dots creating the man-traps, because it kind of leaves questions of how they were able to create the man-traps in the first place and why they would create the man-traps, especially when we know the Dots can just kill people immediately if they wanted to. I did think maybe it was possible that the Dots would have let the man-traps in from the wild woods, but the Doctor does imply that the Dots created the man-traps, and if they had been let in from the wild woods, that wouldn't really explain how they're able to basically program the man-traps to eat them in alphabetical order. But then again, it does lead us to have this really good creature design of the episode, so it's not really a big flaw in my opinion. Now, we then also get the moment where Lindy basically throws Ricky under the bus by revealing that his surname actually begins with a C and that he changed it to September later on, leading to the Dots killing Ricky instead of killing Lindy, which I think is probably one of the main reasons why they chose to do the killing in alphabetical order thing, instead of having it be some other reveal that would be more satisfying to the social commentary of the episode. And this is obviously a great opportunity to show Lindy's true colours ahead of the final scene. And that leads us into the final scene, where we obviously learn that the residents of Fine Time don't accept the Doctor's help because they're all racist and they don't want to go with him because he's black, which I was surprised to find out that some people didn't actually get that that's what this scene was about. But like I said, this scene does obviously still have elements of classism and elitism in there, so I guess people who didn't see that weren't completely wrong. But for me personally, I think the racism in this scene was fairly obvious, especially with a lot of the lines about voodoo and contamination in there. And when you really think about it, and especially if you rewatch this episode, the hints about their racism become a lot more clear throughout, which I think is why this episode benefits so much with rewatchability. I think Nshuti's performance in this moment is absolutely incredible, especially considering it's the first thing he filmed for season 1, and it's definitely a defining 15th Doctor moment. It's probably the defining 15th Doctor moment of this season for me so far. I think my only criticism, and this isn't necessarily for this episode in particular, but for the season as a whole, is that he's cried in pretty much every episode he's been in so far. And while I definitely think it was incredibly warranted in this episode, I think it would have been a lot more impactful if he hadn't cried in pretty much every episode so far. I think for me personally, the episodes where it makes the most sense were definitely The Church on Ruby Road, Boom, and of course this episode. But I think if he hadn't cried in the other episodes as well as that, this would have been a lot more impactful of a moment. But like I said, that's not really a criticism of this episode in particular. I just think this moment would have been a lot more impactful if he hadn't cried so much in previous episodes. This isn't me saying that I don't think this Doctor should be more emotional, I just don't think it was as necessary in episodes like Space Babies or The Devil's Chord, and if he hadn't cried in those episodes, it would have made this moment a lot more impactful for me. But like I said, this moment was still incredibly impactful for me and is definitely the 15th Doctor's most defining moment so far. In conclusion, Dot and Bubble is an episode that really surprised me. I expected it to be a boring and annoying commentary on social media and one of the weaker episodes of the season. However, although there is definitely some of that social media commentary in there, it's not the main focus of the social commentary in this episode. And I really liked the social commentary on class divisions such as class, elitism, and of course racism. And that final scene solidifies this episode as one of the best of the season for me, and a defining moment for the 15th Doctor. I wasn't expecting this episode to be ranked very highly, but after watching it, like I mentioned, I was pleasantly surprised by it. After my first viewing, I was mostly thinking this episode was a fairly mid episode with a great ending. However, after seeing some discussions of it on Twitter, similar to 73 Yards, I started to like it a lot more. And also similar to 73 Yards, I enjoyed this episode even more on rewatch and definitely think it benefits with watching it again. For that reason, this episode has become one of my favourite episodes of this season so far, which really surprised me. Because of that, I'm going to put Dot and Bubble in A tier, and I'm going to move The Devil's Chord down to a B tier. This means I might also consider moving Space Babies down a tier as well, but I'll wait to see the rest of the episodes before I make that judgment. Okay, so the next episode we're getting is Rogue, which I'm not too excited for from the Next Time trailer and clips that we've been given so far. But with that being said, I'm excited to see some brand new writers, which we haven't had in a while, with the only other writer this season, besides RTD, so far being the return of Stephen Moffat. It also looks like a return to the status quo, which has been missing in this season since Space Babies, likely due to the shorter episode count. Doctor Who recently aired its Bridgerton episode, Rogue, but was it any good? Okay, so this episode is one that I wasn't incredibly excited for, but going into an episode with these low expectations has proven very beneficial to me when it came to the previous episode. However, I was at least looking forward to what looked like a more standard episode of Doctor Who after a lot of experimental or Doctor Light episodes that we've had since Space Babies, and I was interested to see the character of Rogue and his relationship with the Doctor. So Rogue sees the Doctor and Ruby landing at a party in Regency era England, where they encounter shape-shifting aliens and a mysterious bounty hunter. But was it any good? Okay, so like I just mentioned in the intro of this video, this episode definitely feels like more of a return to the status quo, and it feels like the first standard Doctor Who episode we've had since Space Babies. Every episode since that has been pretty experimental or has been Doctor Light, and I think that's definitely a downside of the shorter episode count, but like I said, this episode is like a return to the status quo, and it feels like it would fit right into the first RTD era in my opinion. We have the main villains of this episode being the Chord, who are a fun but fairly standard Doctor Who villain, which once again again we've not really had since Space Babies, but they definitely had a much more unique and interesting motivation, with them wanting to cosplay, or more accurately LARP, all across the universe. However, they're not incredibly fleshed out or focused on in this episode, but that's because the focus of this episode isn't really on the Childer, it's on the Doctor and Rogue. Okay, so I think the introduction of the character Rogue is done really well. I think I've heard someone else mention it in this way, I can't remember who, but it feels like Rogue is the main character in his own story somewhere, and we're just kind of entering his story. You can kind of imagine him going off already doing these different bounty hunting missions and stuff like that. So I think that really fleshes the character out nicely. There's obviously also the scene in Rogue's spaceship, which I think was really good. It was another fun scene where we learn a lot more about Rogue as a character, and although I liked the moment, I do feel like the Kylie Minogue music, the moment with that goes on for maybe a little bit too long, but I did still enjoy it, like I say. Obviously in this scene as well, we also get the moment with the holograms of the Doctor's previous faces, where we get a look at Richard E. Grant's Schalke Doctor, or what is assumed to be the Schalke Doctor, but it could also be maybe the Curse of Fatal Death Doctor. And for me personally, I don't think this really means anything. I think it is just a fun little Easter egg for people that know about it, which I think is nice, but you know, it could also maybe be hinting at different timelines or parallel universes or something like that, but I personally don't think that's what it's about. Now, I personally think the Doctor and Rogue had really good chemistry, but I can sort of agree with some people who think their relationship was slightly rushed, as it was all in one episode. However, the scene with them connecting in the TARDIS, for me, really helped solidify their relationship. It's also nice to see a scene inside the TARDIS interior in this episode, because we haven't really been inside the TARDIS since the first week with Space Babies and the Devil's Chord, and I feel like that's really been missing this season, which is weird, especially considering how large and especially expensive this TARDIS set must have been. It's a little bit odd that we haven't seen it more because of that. Okay, so Ruby sort of gets a little bit sidelined in this episode in favour of focusing on the Doctor and Rogue, which is a bit unfortunate because we haven't had much of a sense of the Doctor and Ruby's relationship this season, particularly since Boom, besides the fact that they're just having a lot of fun, which makes it feel a little bit out of place when the Doctor calls her his best friend in this episode, although I do personally believe it because we know how long they've been travelling for now. It would have still been nice if we could have seen it more this season. With that being said, I still quite like Ruby's subplot in this episode. The conversations with Ruby and Emily are very good, but they are let down a little bit by the reveal of Emily being a Childer. But I think Ruby's subplot also nicely feeds into the end of this episode and fits really well with the ending, even if it does feel like she's sidelined for most of the episode. Okay, so when it comes to the ending of this episode, obviously we get the moment where the Doctor thinks Ruby has been turned into a Childer or has been killed and the Childer is playing her, which I think was a pretty good reveal that was set up well with the battle mode mention at the start of the episode. And I didn't personally see it coming straight away, but I did start to figure it out and put the pieces together before it was actually revealed to us. But with that being said, I do feel like it was a little bit unfair on the audience, because we saw the shot of them screaming and the lightning coming from the doorway, and we also had the moments where Ruby's neck is cracking, suggesting that she's a Childer, which don't really make sense when you find out that she isn't actually a Childer, and that she fought off the Childer that was pretending to be Emily. I also think the moment with the Doctor wanting the Childer to suffer after thinking Ruby was dead was personally very in character. We've seen it before in episodes like Family of Blood and Heaven Sent. However, it doesn't really make much sense, as we know he already changed the settings of the Triform before this point, so the fate of the Childer was already the same before he thought Ruby was dead anyway. Once again, we have the Doctor crying in this episode, which I think it makes sense for this episode personally, especially when he thinks Ruby is dead. It works less for Rogue because he only just met him, but like I said, I personally buy their chemistry. But I still think this would have been a lot more impactful if he hadn't already cried in every episode so far. For example, if he didn't cry in Space Babies or The Devil's Chord, where I personally don't think it was as needed as the other episodes. I also think this moment would have been a lot more impactful if the flashback moment we had already been in one of the episodes of this season before, instead of being written and filmed just for this moment. For example, if they managed to fit it in the end of Space Babies or The Devil's Chord or Boom or something like that. We obviously have the moment where the Doctor and Rogue kiss, which is very satisfying because it gives us a payoff for their relationship in this episode, but it's also there for Rogue to take the Triform activation device off of the Doctor, so it works both if you did or didn't buy their chemistry or relationship in this episode. We obviously have the moment where Rogue sacrifices himself to swap with Ruby on the Triform, which some people understandably don't like, as surely she could have just come off it some other way if Rogue was just able to shove her off. But personally, I think it's well set up, as we know there's a limit of only 6 people on the Triform, so if an extra person like Rogue goes on there, Ruby would be able to leave as it can only carry 6 people. And then we get the moment at the end of this episode where the Doctor Doctor is on about going to save Rogue one day. I know some people aren't happy with this moment, as it seems like the Doctor gives up trying to find Rogue very quickly, with the comments about different dimensions and not knowing his name, but I personally read this moment as him going to save Rogue one day when he finds out how to, especially with him parking Rogue's ship and wearing the ring as a reminder. In conclusion, I think Rogue was a fun episode of Season 1 and a nice return to the status quo, which I think was needed with most of the episodes being more experimental this season and with the shorter episode count not allowing for as many filler episodes. I think it was a very serviceable plot that would fit perfectly into the first RTD era, with fun villains in the shoulder. However, the villains clearly aren't supposed to be the main focus of this episode, with that being the relationship between the Doctor and Rogue, who I think was a great new character with good chemistry between the pair. For me personally, I think I'm going to rank this at B tier with the Devil's Chord, because although I really liked it, there are still some issues with it, and it is at the end of the day a fairly standard episode of Doctor Who, which I'm happy for because I feel like that was missing from this season. Next episode is the first part of the two-part finale, which I'm very excited to see what all of it means, and I'm really hoping the second part sticks the landing. Okay, so we just got the first part of the two-part finale of Doctor Who Season 1, The Legend of Ruby Sunday, and I just wanted to come on and give my first impressions of the episode, because obviously there's a very big cliffhanger in this and a lot to talk about, or maybe actually not too much to talk about besides that ending really, but I really wanted to get my first impressions out very quickly. It's going to be very unedited and completely unscripted from me, so we'll see how well this goes, but I just felt like it was worth talking about this in a first impressions video, mostly because obviously there's that big cliffhanger to talk about, but also because I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to approach the review for this episode, or if I do one at all, but I am going to try and do one. I'll talk about that a little bit later on, because basically there's not a whole lot to this episode in terms of like the plot and stuff, in my opinion. This episode is a lot of setup, which kind of makes sense because it's a two-part finale. It's the first episode of a two-part finale, but obviously it'd still be nice for this episode to kind of stand on its own as a story as well. So for me, this is going to be maybe not the best episode on a rewatch, but I will say I did have a really good time watching it for the first time this morning, or at least this morning when I'm recording this video right now. This might be coming out on Sunday. And I especially had a great time when it was the last sort of couple of minutes of this episode when we got the big reveal, which is obviously that Sutekh is the main villain of this episode. But yeah, besides that final moment, that final cliffhanger reveal of the episode, the rest of the episode is just a lot of setup, which I feel is not going to be that interesting on a rewatch. But with that being said, I haven't rewatched the episode yet, so maybe that will change. I think RTD was definitely right when he said people should record their reactions to the end of this episode, because if I recorded mine, it would have been pretty insane. I was going a little bit crazy, because honestly, although people were speculating that Sutekh was going to be the main villain of this story, and although I did think it was at least possible, I was kind of 50-50 on the idea, and the closer it was getting to this episode airing, the less likely I thought it would be that it would actually be Sutekh, and I was expecting it to just be like a new villain or something like that. There was also even a point in this episode where I thought they were going to bring back the Beast from Series 2, because Carla mentions the Beast at some point, and I guess I'm not too far off because Gabriel Wolfe did come back to voice Sutekh in this episode, and I assume the next episode, and he also voiced the Beast in Series 2, so it's possible we might get some sort of connection there or something mentioned in the next episode that links these characters together, because I assume they both come from the same sort of pantheon of gods, and it's also possible it's the same character with it being the same voice actor, but who knows. But yeah, I think that reveal was done really well, and like I said, even though people were speculating this for a while now, I did not expect them to actually do it, so I was still incredibly shocked and I guess surprised when that moment happened, which I didn't expect to be, because number one, I didn't expect it to actually be Sutekh, and well, that's kind of it really. I just didn't expect it to actually be the case, so it was still surprising even with all the speculation around Sutekh before the episode aired. I think the red herrings of this episode are done really well, because obviously people had already been putting together the different anagrams of S Triad, Susan Triad, all that stuff, speculating that it could have something to do with Susan and the TARDIS, and I like the fact that they just get that out of the way at the start of the episode, because it really shows that Russell is like, yeah, we expected you to figure this out, and so the characters in the episode figure it out immediately as well, and it sort of acts as this red herring with the Doctor thinking that it could be Susan throughout the whole episode and could have something to do with her, which obviously doesn't end up being the case. It ends up being Sutekh. I do feel like it is still a bit weird kind of leading us on to think that it was going to be Susan when it wasn't, but at the same time it does work as a red herring and adds to the shock of the final reveal of the episode. episode. But with that being said, I do feel like it's still possible we might get something to do with Susan at the end of the next episode, or at some point in the next episode. It's possible it could have something to do with Ruby, although what I personally think is more likely is with the Doctor having these conversations with Kate about meeting Susan again and seeing Susan again. I feel like that could maybe inspire the Doctor to go and meet Susan Foreman at the end of the next episode, still played by Carol Ann Ford or something like that. But at the same time, it's still entirely possible it could be to do with Ruby, Ruby's mum, Ruby's family, or even like Mrs. Flood, although Mrs. Flood seems like an evil character, so I don't really see that being the case. But I think we might see Carol Ann Ford next episode, with the Doctor going to maybe see her at the end. But yeah, like I said, besides that big reveal at the end, the episode itself is probably going to suffer on rewatch because it's a lot of setup and I don't think there's really that much there. But that's not to say I didn't enjoy it. I still had a very fun time during all that part of the episode, during the whole episode. It just really comes down to what next week is going to have in stock for us, and if it doesn't stick the landing next week, it could definitely hinder this episode in my eyes, which is part of the reason why I'm not sure how I'm going to approach the review for this episode, because I almost feel like I need to see next week's episode before I can kind of discuss it properly. But I'm going to see what I can do. I'll try and still record a review for this episode, but I'm just letting you know now that this might be it until we get both episodes, because I don't know how I'm going to get on with that review. Another thing I do want to mention is, although I really like the design of the new Sutekh, the big kind of jackal that he is at the end of the episode, I do also hope we get a more classic Sutekh design in the next episode, because I feel like he's much more menacing and scary when he's just the guy in the helmet and he's not moving a whole lot. But I don't know how likely that's going to be with how big he seems to be in this episode. He might stay in that form throughout the whole of the next episode, which I personally am not going to be a big fan of, but we'll see how that goes. We might get a more classic Sutekh design in the next episode. I'm also not sure how this is going to work for people that don't know who Sutekh is and haven't seen Pyramids of Mars before, especially with this going for new audiences on Disney Plus, people that haven't seen any Doctor Who before. It's a bit weird with a whole series of new villains and new concepts for them to then just throw in Sutekh, who some even casual Doctor Who fans aren't really going to know too much about Sutekh, or maybe not even know who he is. And that's fans of the show that have been watching since like 2005, since Christopher Eccleston. Luckily for me, I've seen Pyramids of Mars. I saw it for the first time, I think, last year, and I really enjoyed it and was really looking forward to it possibly being Sutekh. But I just don't know how this is going to land for particularly brand new viewers, but even people who are casual fans of the show who haven't heard of Sutekh before, because the twist probably isn't going to hit as hard for them. The episode could still maybe work, and particularly next week could still work for them, because they're going to kind of get a sense of the character, and maybe they'll watch the Tales of the TARDIS that's happening before, which is probably going to be Pyramids of Mars. But if they don't already know who this character is, if they're not already familiar with it, I'm not sure how well this episode in particular, and particularly the cliffhanger, is going to hit for them. So I'd be interested to see how that pans out. But yeah, let me know what you think about this episode in the comments down below, and hopefully I'll be getting a review of this episode out in the next week, but like I said, I'm not sure how I'm going to approach that. Okay, so I'm back again to do a first impressions video on the finale of Doctor Who Season 1, The Empire of Death, or Empire of Death I should say. Once again, this is going to be unscripted like the last one. It's just going to be my free-flowing thoughts on the episode, but this time there is a lot more time in between when I first watched the episode to when I'm recording it at the moment, because I actually watched this one at the cinema at midnight last night. It's the first episode of this season that I've watched at midnight. All the other ones I've watched when I woke up in the morning, but I decided I really wanted to go and see this one at the cinema to have that experience, because it's something I've never done before for Doctor Who. I never got around to doing it for the 50th anniversary specials and stuff like that, so that was a fun experience. It was really good to watch it on the big screen, as well as the first part of the finale, and yeah, it was a very nice experience. We got a special message from Millie Gibson before it played. One weird thing, and I think this is the same for pretty much everybody that went to the cinema screenings, there was a 15-minute interval in between, which I was expecting, but it did mean that the episode started like 5 or 10 minutes later than it would have dropped on iPlayer for other people. But it's not really a problem, because it's not like in that time I was going to go on my phone and somebody was going to have skipped to the end and put spoilers on Twitter or something like that. So it's not the end of the world, but it was a little bit interesting, and it seems most people had that similar experience. But yeah, overall, watching it in the cinema was a very fun experience, and that's the only time I've watched it as recording this video. So it was quite a few hours ago for me now. But I also think that might have made my viewing of this episode and my opinion of this episode a lot higher than it was, because I actually came out of this episode quite enjoying it. I didn't love it, but overall I had a really good time watching it, and I'm wondering if part of that is because I watched it at the cinema, because I know a lot of people aren't too happy with this episode and some things in this episode, and most of the stuff that I've seen people say I do actually agree with, but I just personally still quite enjoyed this episode. It didn't stick the landing as much as I wanted it to, but I still had a really fun time with it. But I'm going to be rewatching it at some point. By the time this video's gone out, I will have already rewatched the episode, so we'll see how my opinion of that changes when I get to the full in-depth review for this episode. But overall, I really enjoyed it. It wasn't the best thing ever, but I had a fun time. So to begin with, before going into this episode, I was anticipating and expecting there to unfortunately be some sort of reset button because of how high the stakes were and because of Russell T Davies' finales in the past. It was something that I was definitely anticipating, and my fears of that kind of grew even more when in the first 5 or so minutes of the episode, pretty much everybody we care about besides the Doctor, Ruby and Mel all get wiped out by Sutekh. There was a slight second where when Kate got wiped out by the dust, I was thinking, okay, she's going to come back at the end of the episode, but in the back of my mind I was kind of like, okay, is this it for Kate Stewart actually? Because the speech she gave and the moment itself was actually really good, so I was sort of thinking, oh, maybe this actually could be it for Kate, but also still thought there's probably going to be reset at the end. And then as soon as, you know, Carla and Cherry and Mrs. Flood all got wiped out as well, I was kind of like, oh, okay, we are definitely going to get a reset button at the end of this episode, which I was already anticipating before the episode began, to be honest, and it is a little bit unfortunate, but I'll get more onto that when I get to the end of the episode. As for Sutekh in this episode, he wasn't in it a whole lot, which is a little bit disappointing, because after the reveal at the end of the first part, I was excited to see Sutekh. Like I said in my first impressions last week, I was hoping that we'd get a classic Sutekh design, but after seeing the Tales of the TARDIS episode with Pyramids of Mars, I realised that probably wasn't a possibility. It probably wasn't going to happen because they basically said that Sutekh had evolved, which they also restated in this episode. So it's a bit disappointing we didn't get to see that, but at the same time, after watching this episode, I actually don't really mind because I kind of liked the way he was in this episode, especially the fact that he was just leaning on the TARDIS like it was nothing, and he was just, there was moments where he like span it around and stuff like that. I thought that was really interesting, but it still would have maybe been nice to see a classic Sutekh design in this episode, at least just for like a brief moment. But yeah, he's also just really not in this episode a whole lot. He's there at the start. I love the moment at the start in Unit before everything kind of goes to shit. Then we kind of see him intermittently throughout, and then obviously at the end. But the middle of the episode, I'm not too sure how I feel about it, because I don't mind that we kind of get a space to breathe for a little bit, a little chance to breathe when they're in the memory TARDIS and stuff like that, but it does start to get a bit boring for a high stakes finale, and I just wish there was more of a sense of getting to see the devastation of what Sutekh has caused and the kind of desolate planets and stuff like that. But we don't really get much of that. We just kind of get one moment where they're in some tent where we don't really get to see the outside world and what it looks like and the desolation surrounding them. And we get the moment in like the city hall or whatever where Roger Ap Gwilliam was working to try and get the DNA test and stuff like that. So I do kind of wish we got to see more of that instead of them just sitting in the memory TARDIS for a lot of it. So I think the best parts of this episode are the start of the episode and the end of the episode, although there is still some issues with the end of the episode, which I will get to. So getting on to the way they basically defeated Sutekh, I don't mind parts of it. I know a lot of people aren't happy with the fact that the Doctor and Ruby basically just get Sutekh on a lead and just drag him through the time vortex. I don't mind it too much because it's kind of set up with the intelligent gloves and the intelligent rope, which we've kind of already got set up all the way back in Church on Ruby Road. And it also leads to some really good visuals that I actually really liked where they're dragging Sutekh through the time vortex. And I love the shots where he's kind of like clawing at the time vortex and it's kind of revealing where they are behind it and stuff like that. I thought that was some really good visual effects shots there. And I also like seeing the visual effects shots of Ncuti at the TARDIS doors shouting at Sutekh as it's traveling through the time vortex. I think that looked really good, but I can definitely see why that defeat of Sutekh is a little bit disappointing for some people, especially like I said at the start of this video, the whole reset button where the Doctor basically just brings everybody back to life, which like I said, I was expecting after everybody got wiped out at the start. It is a little bit of a cop-out. It does kind of make some sense, because if you bring death to death, I guess that kind of makes life in a way, which is kind of the explanation they give, but it does feel a little bit unsatisfying and a bit of a cop-out. But like I said, I really liked the visuals of that moment, so it definitely helps it a little bit, and it's a nice action-packed moment for what should have been a really big blockbuster finale episode. So yeah, like I said, I quite enjoyed that moment, but I can see why some people don't like that resolution, and for me personally, the reset button I'm not a big fan of, even though I knew it was coming and I was kind of anticipating it a little bit. As for the reveal with Ruby and who her parents were, I was really worried that Ruby was going to be revealed to be somebody really special and some kind of godlike entity and stuff like that. So I personally like the reveal and was hoping for the reveal where Ruby was going to basically be a nobody, because to me it reminded me of Star Wars The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker, which I really liked the reveal of Rey in The Last Jedi being revealed to be a nobody. I think it worked really well for that film, and I think it was a really great reveal for the franchise, and it was really disappointing when in Rise of Skywalker they revealed that she was a Palpatine. And so I'm glad they basically did the good version of that and stuck to it in Doctor Who, unless they obviously reverse it in the future, but I doubt it, because Russell actually said in the commentary for this episode that he was actually inspired by that because he didn't like that they went back on that decision in the next film. So I'm assuming he's not going to go back on that decision, and I'm glad that he revealed it that way and revealed it to be that. Although I liked that reveal personally, it does bring up more questions which don't really get answered in the episode, because there's obviously the whole theme of when Ruby's remembering those memories, it kind of starts snowing around her wherever she is, and now that it's been revealed that it's an ordinary person that's her mum, that starts to make a bit less sense, and I don't think that's going to be explained in the future. I feel like it's maybe meant to be explained by some of the supernatural elements that are in the story or something like that, or that have been present in this season, but we don't really get an explanation for that, and it does make a lot less sense after the reveal. And then there's also the whole reveal as well where she wasn't actually pointing at the Doctor, she was pointing at the lamppost, which is actually the signpost of Ruby Road, and it's actually her naming Ruby, which it is a nice moment and a nice reveal, but it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because it's kind of like, why would she be pointing at that when nobody's around to see it, nobody's going to know? I don't know if it's maybe meant to be implied that it was for the CCTV and she knew there was CCTV or something like that, but even then, in the CCTV, you're not really going to be able to spot that, so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And also the stuff with the Doctor and Ruby's memory of that moment changing, that kind of doesn't make sense either, because she didn't initially point, so it does kind of bring up a lot of questions like that with this reveal. But like I said, ultimately I am a big fan of the reveal of Ruby's mum not being somebody special, and I also really liked the final moments with the Doctor and Ruby and her biological mother. I think that's really the heart of the episode and a really nice way to finish off the episode. My only thing is, I did speculate from the last episode that I thought the Doctor was going to go and see Susan and be inspired by the conversation he had with Kate to go and see Susan at the end of this episode, and I almost thought we were going to get that when he mentioned Susan to Ruby, or Ruby mentioned Susan to him, I suppose, when they were in the TARDIS at the end there, and I thought we were about to get that for a moment, and we didn't, which is a little bit disappointing. But the Doctor did still, mention her and say he's inspired by Ruby now to maybe go and find her one day, so maybe they're setting that up to happen in the future. But I just think after setting up all the red herrings with Susan Triad being Susan, it would have been nice to actually go and see her at the end of the episode, even if it wasn't connected to the whole Sutekh thing. It would have been nice for the Doctor to have actually been inspired to go and see her at the end of this episode, which he kind of almost is, but it's kind of implied that he's going to do it at a later date. So that's one of my only other issues really with this episode. I'm a lot more positive on this episode than a lot of other people have been, but what me and my friend have said since watching it, the friend that I went to go and watch it with at the cinema, is it's one of those episodes where you really enjoy it in the moment, at least for me and him, but it's one of those where the more you think about it, the kind of lower your opinion of it gets, because you kind of start thinking about all these things that don't really make sense with some of the reveals, and maybe, you're finding some plot holes and stuff when you start to think about it. And so I'm worried that is going to impact my rewatch of this episode, and when I rewatch it later on, or by the time you're watching this, I will have already rewatched it, and I'm worried that I'm not going to enjoy it as much during that. But overall, I think I've been a bit more positive on this episode than most people, but I certainly understand most of the critiques that other people have had for this episode, and I agree with them. It's just that I personally still had a pretty good time watching it, which, like I said, may have been the cinema experience, and it may not be the same when I rewatch it, but we'll see how it is. And if you want to know my updated thoughts after the rewatch, I will be doing a full in-depth review of this episode alongside The Legend of Ruby Sunday, because I didn't get around to doing a full in-depth review for that, so I'm going to do one video covering both parts of the finale, probably within the next week or so.
Doctor Who Season 1 is over, but is The Legend of Ruby Sunday and Empire of Death Russell T Davies' worst finale? Okay, so I've already posted my first impressions on both of these episodes, but what do I think now that they've both aired and we've had more time to think on them? The Season 1 finale sees the Doctor and Ruby arriving at UNIT to try to get to the bottom of a mysterious woman they've been seeing throughout their previous adventures, along with finding out the mysteries around Ruby's birth, leading them into a trap set up by the returning villain Sutekh. But is this story any good? Okay, so The Legend of Ruby Sunday opens up with a red herring of S-Triad Technologies being an anagram for TARDIS technology, which I think was a clever thing to get out of the way in the cold open, as they were already expecting fans to have picked up on this, which they had, but they likely weren't expecting fans to have picked up on the correct anagram, Sutek, if you can even call that an anagram. But overall, I think this was a very clever thing to get out of the way, and to even have the unit team dismissing as something being so obvious and easy, because a lot of the audience already figured it out before this episode had even aired, and so it just shows that Russell T Davies already knew that would be the case, and it's just getting straight into it. We also immediately jump off with the Doctor and Ruby speculating as to whether or not Susan Triad could be the Doctor's granddaughter, Susan, adding to the red herrings in this episode. There's a nice moment between the Doctor and Kate Stewart where they discuss whether or not the Doctor wants it to be Susan, which I personally had hoped would lead to the Doctor choosing to go and see her at the end of the second part, which unfortunately doesn't happen. However, she still does get a mention, with him saying he'll eventually find her one day. My main issue with the Susan Triad stuff in this story is that once she's revealed to be a minion of Sutek at the end of the first part, that is all she is throughout the whole of the second part. There's no more mention of Triad Technologies or what that was all about, and Triad Technologies was set up in the Giggle with RTD hinting that it would have some huge ramifications for UNIT, but ultimately it's never brought up again, with Kate Stewart offering Susan a job at UNIT at the end of the second part, which doesn't make sense knowing she's already a tech billionaire. Ultimately, most of this first episode is just set up for the next part, which for me leads to a pace that is very meandering, with not a lot actually happening, and it mostly taking place all in one location inside of UNIT, which doesn't feel really good on the pacing of the episode. The Sutek cliffhanger is probably my favourite part of this story. Even though it was speculated that Sutek would be the main villain of this story, I honestly wasn't sure if it would actually happen, because it was never actually leaked, just heavily speculated based on the Sutek anagram, the dust in the trailers, and so on. RTD was definitely right when he said to film the reactions to this story, because if I did, you would have seen that I went crazy, because I just didn't expect it to actually happen. I also really liked the opening action sequence to Empire of Death. However, everyone dying at the start made it very clear that there was just going to be an inevitable reset button at the end of the episode. When Kate died, I assumed it was possible that that was it for her, but still unlikely. But as soon as Carla, Cherry, and Mrs. Flood, who's hinted at having future plans, died alongside Kate Stewart, I knew that this would all be reset by the end of the episode, which definitely lowers the stakes significantly. As much as I said I loved the cliffhanger to the first episode, I think the first episode could have benefited from the cliffhanger actually being the moment where Kate Stewart dies, because it means the stakes would have felt higher at the end of the episode and shown the power of Sutek, instead of just removing the stakes at the start of the next episode and making it obvious that there was inevitably going to be a reset button at the end. It also would have allowed for the pacing of the first episode to feel less meandering, as some of the slower moments could have been cut down to fit this moment in as the cliffhanger. As well as this, it would have also allowed us to spend more time exploring the desolation in the second part, as the opening to the second part would have been the ending to the previous part, allowing for more time for this desolation of Earth and other planets to be shown. The moments in the memory TARDIS is nice for the episode to take a bit of a breather, and I love the moment where the Doctor is screaming into the void of space, although this moment would have been more impactful if the Doctor hadn't cried in every episode so far. But it does also make it feel like this episode quickly comes to a halt and doesn't feel as large scale as it could, with us not really getting to see the desolation on Earth from a ground level and feel the stakes. We then have a bit of a time jump where we have a nice human moment with the Doctor and a woman who's all on her own and losing her memories. Like I said, this is a nice human moment for the episode, but once again it would have been nice to see more of the desolation outside of this scene, and ultimately this scene only leads to the Doctor getting a spoon to make the screen work better. We then see Roger Ap Gwilliam from 73 Yards appear on the screen, and for a second I was worried we were going to get answers about 73 Yards, which if you've seen my review on that episode you'll know is something that I don't want. Luckily this is just a small moment that doesn't ruin 73 Yards for me and ultimately has very little impact on that episode, which I'm happy about. Now I know some people are annoyed that this moment wasn't actually in 73 Yards, or even think that it may have been a deleted scene from 73 Yards, but for me this really doesn't bother me, as mandatory DNA testing is something that would be very in character for Roger Ap Gwilliam's authoritarian government, but it maybe still would have been nice to see this moment actually in 73 Yards. After the reveal of Sutek in the first part, I was really hoping we would see a more classic Sutek design in the second part. Unfortunately, we didn't get that, but I do think he looks a lot better in Empire of Death than he did at the end of Legend of Ruby Sunday. I particularly like the moment where he's leaning over the TARDIS like it's nothing and even spins it around at one point. With all that being said, Sutek is unfortunately barely in the second part and his presence isn't really felt, but when he is there, he is incredibly voiced by the returning Gabriel Wolf, who absolutely still has it at the age of 91. mighty one. Now, Sutek's defeat is definitely one of the most disappointing moments in this episode for most people. I personally don't mind as much him being dragged by a big dog lead and flown through the time vortex. It's something that I think is a nice play on him being portrayed as basically a big dog, and is well set up with the reintroduction of the intelligent gloves and the introduction of the intelligent rope earlier on in the episode. And it also leads to some nice visuals as they're flying him through the time vortex, with the Doctor shouting to him through the TARDIS doors. However, it's definitely odd that they decided to defeat a villain who has been set up to be so powerful in this way, especially when we know that sending Sutek into the time vortex is how the Fourth Doctor originally thought he had defeated him in the first place, which ultimately ended up not being the case. I also think the explanation for how everybody is brought back to life is very half-baked and not well explained, leading to it ultimately just feeling like a big reset button that magically brings everybody back to life. I think Ruby's mother being revealed to be an ordinary person was definitely the right way to go, and was what I was hoping for. It's a good response to the terrible decision Star Wars made with The Rise of Skywalker by reversing the decision of Rey being a nobody and instead making her a Palpatine. But this does ultimately lead to some questions about things that were set up previously in the season relating to Ruby, such as it snowing around her whenever she thought about the night that she was abandoned, and why her mother was dressed in a cult-like robe when abandoning her at the church on Ruby Road. The moment where she points at the street sign is also very laughable, especially when it was established as being a changed memory earlier on in the season, and the sign not even being visible in the scene in the church on Ruby Road. Ruby's exit is one of my favourite scenes in this episode, and gives a perfect excuse as to why she needs to leave the show, at least for the time being, because as much as she wants to continue travelling with the Doctor, she has more important things going on at home. However, this moment is let down by two things for me personally. Number one, we really haven't had enough episodes or screen time with these two to really establish their relationship and chemistry, with this season only being 8 episodes long and them not always being together in a lot of the episodes. And number two, the Doctor crying, although warranted in this particular scene, is made less impactful due to the fact that he's cried in every episode up until this point, excluding 73 Yards, which he was barely in. And as mentioned earlier, I also think it would have been nice if the Doctor went to see his granddaughter Susan after this moment, as it would have made all the Susan teasing in the previous episode feel a lot less like just a red herring, and more like something that was linked to the themes and arcs of this season, and would have felt like a lot more of a satisfactory payoff to her mentions in both the Devil's Chord and the previous episode. Overall, although I seem to have enjoyed this finale more than most people, it still isn't perfect and is definitely RTD's worst finale yet. Despite the incredible cliffhanger, the first part is mostly set up with a meandering pace, with the second part, although being a fun ride, ends with an unsatisfactory conclusion with the defeat of Sutek and the reveal of Ruby's lineage that in some ways leaves more questions than answers. If I were to rank these episodes, I'd probably put The Legend of Ruby Sunday at B tier, with The Empire of Death at C or D tier. But let me know what you think about this finale in the comments down below, and let me know what you think about this season as a whole. With that being said, I'd just like to give a shout out to my patron, the Beast Boss. If you want to join the Patreon, I'll have it linked in the description down below, and if you want to see all of my season 1 reviews so far, I'll make sure to have the playlist for those on screen now.